Good morning, everyone. Bonjour à tous. For the interpretation, you just plug the headset in and you switch to English or French. So pour l'interprétation, vous installez les écouteurs et appuyez sur 1 ou 2 pour la langue et vous pouvez choisir la langue aussi en ligne. You can also choose the language online. So welcome, everyone. Thanks a lot for being here. Let me start with the land acknowledgement. York University recognizes that many indigenous nations have long-standing relationship with the territories among which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many indigenous nations. The area known as Toronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Unadabsoname Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis community. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation. The territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon, One Pond Belt Covenant, an agreement to peacefully share and take care of the Great Lake regions. Thank you again to everyone for coming or connecting to this conference. I am Valerio De Stefano, and I am the Canada Research Chair in Innovation Law and Society at Osgoode Law School and co-editor with Professor Salas Lin of the Comparative Labor Law and Policy Journal. We have wanted to organize this conference with Unifor, which is the largest private sector union in Canada, to deal with a topic that is more and more central in the working life of many people in Canada and around the world. Today we will hear from many, and tomorrow we will hear many different perspectives from academics, workers, management, and policymakers. And the idea of this conference is actually to join forces to discuss a topic that, again, is more and more central to workplaces in Canada and around the world. What is happening is that the technology that has been introduced in our workplaces is changing work, and in many cases, this is not necessarily for good. We will hear many perspectives around this, but I think a couple of key messages that I think this conference will also want to propose is that, first of all, AI, artificial intelligence at work, is not just a matter of how many jobs are going to be lost, but it's also crucially a matter of job quality. The technology affects how people work and changes working life, and in some cases, not necessarily for the good. The other message, which I think is quite crucial, is that we don't have to take technology as if it was rainfall. We can shape technology. Policy and regulation can shape technology for good, and this is what we are here for, to put together academics, policymakers, labor unions, and management to discuss and see what the way forward should be. Ultimately, what happens in the world of work, what happens in workplaces, is a crucial component of what happens in society and affects democracy and the rule of law. Labor regulation and institutions are there to establish the rule of law at work, and without the rule of law at work, you cannot have the rule of law in society. So it is crucial that institutions and regulation take pace with the speed of innovation and technology and shape it for good. And this is what we will try to do today. Before passing the floor to my colleague Roxane Dubois, I want to thank, of course, Osgoode Law School and Osgoode Professional Development, which are hosting here today, and Dean Trevor Farrow and Associate Dean for Research, Professor Tanguy Renaud, for supporting this conference. The main funding for this conference comes from my Canada Research Chair grants, and we have a generous sponsorship from Unifor. We also have received funding for which we are grateful from the Nathanson Center at York University. So we are very thankful to its directors for supporting us. And finally, last but not least, massive thanks to our communication team, to Yvette Young and Megan Carrington for their wonderful administrative support. And of course, thanks to Unifor from me and to Roxane Dubois in particular for believing in the project. And I now turn the floor to Roxane.
Thank you. Thanks, Valerio. Yes, so welcome. My name is Roxane. I'm the Chief of Staff to the Unifor National President, Lana Payne, who will be joining us a little bit later today. Hello to all the Unifor folks in the room. We have a good contingent that made sure to sit at the back of the room, even though we can see you very well. So we're glad to have you here and to do really what we wanted to do here, which is provide a space to combine the voices of workers with some government representatives, with some industry representatives, and also with some academics who work on studying the issues that we live and fight for on a daily basis. So really, that's what this space is about for today and tomorrow. And so it's going to be a little bit untraditional for a union perspective, but we know that there's so many experience and knowledge that comes from the people who represent workers and who are workers and who fight for workers to be in this space as well. So that's really what we hoped to do today. I'm going to go into a little bit more details about the translation devices so everybody knows how they work. You have to plug them in so that they turn on, otherwise they won't turn on. I encourage you to do that just in case we have some interpretation. In fact, I'm going to speak French now so we can try them out. Donc, on vous souhaite la bienvenue à l'événement. Je veux m'assurer que ça fonctionne très bien pour vous et que si on a des interventions en français, que les machines vont bien fonctionner. So you should be plugging it in and then you select channel 1 for English and channel 2 for French. Donc, si je continue à parler en français, est-ce que ça fonctionne? Are they reversed? So it's channel 1 for French and channel 2 for English. Donc, si je parle en français, tout devrait bien fonctionner. Vous allez bien me comprendre dans vos oreilles et il n'y aura pas de problème avec la traduction pour la durée de l'événement. Tout va bien? J'ai des thumbs up. Merci beaucoup. Oh non, ça va, bienvenue. Donc, ça fonctionne la traduction? J'ai juste besoin d'un signal. Oui, non? Oui. OK, merci. Donc c'est un peu ça. That kind of covers what we wanted to start with. We have a series of panels for today and tomorrow, but you will notice that there are floor microphones, and those are for you, for anybody who would like to make some interventions following the panels, following the discussions, because that is hopefully where we get the rich exchange that we can get out of a room like this. I think that's it for me. We wanted to wish you a great conference. Thank you for being here, and let's get started. Okay, passing it over to the next panel.
All right, thank you. Before I introduce our first speaker, my name is Graham Cox, by the way. I work for Unifor as a national researcher for the marine, rail, and energy and shipbuilding sectors. I wanted to just introduce this session and say your job here, as we go through for this session at least, is to limit the amount of time that I have to speak. So lots of people at the microphone asking questions. Otherwise, I'm going to be asking some very esoteric political economy questions that nobody wants to hear the answers to. So our first speaker is Janine Berg. She's a senior economist in the research department of the International Labour Organization in Geneva, Switzerland. Since joining the ILO in 2002, she's conducted research on economic and social effects of labor regulation, as well as provided technical assistance to the ILO constituents on policies for generating jobs and improving working conditions. From 2008 to 2011, Janine worked at the ILO office in Brazil as an employment specialist. From 2018 to 2019, she served the Secretariat of the ILO Global Commission on the Future of Work. She's an author of several books and policy reports, as well as numerous articles on employment, labor market institutions, and the future of work. Her current area of focus is on transformations in the world of work and regulatory compliance. Janine received her PhD in economics from the New School of Social Research in New York, and she'll be providing an overview in this presentation of where we are with automation around specifically generative AI, and where jobs are at risk, where are they exposed to automation, and then after that, we'll sort of lead a discussion around those issues, and hopefully there's lots of questions from the floor. So I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks. I said, good morning, bonjour. Thank you very much for the invitation. Really, it's a pleasure to be with you all. So we'll talk a little bit about AI in the world of work. Feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions while I'm speaking, if something's not clear. I'll just tell you a little bit about my thinking on this topic, which evolves every day as the technology changes. So it's a little bit just kind of my reflections and also some of the work that we've been doing at the ILO over the past several years on this topic. So when ChatGPT was launched in November 2022, we started getting all of these headlines in the newspaper like this one, AI apocalypse could take away almost 8 million jobs in the UK. And this one's probably my favorite. This is from the IMF chief, Kristalina Georgieva, who says that the AI is going to hit the labor market like a tsunami. I go back and forth myself when I use AI about how much potential there is for automation. I do think there is a lot of hype about what it can do, and there's a lot of limitations of what it can do. But of course, it also is sometimes very impressive as a tool. So I think when I was thinking about this metaphor of Kristalina Georgieva of tsunami, which I don't think is really a good one, I was trying to think of what would be a good metaphor. So I came up with a sinkhole. Because I think there are certain occupations that really are at risk, and it could happen quickly, especially since the technology moves quickly. But often, really, the transformation is pretty gradual. So when I was younger, which I think is probably about the same age as a lot of the people in this room, I used to go to the video rental stores all the time. And then just all of a sudden, they just kind of started to disappear, and you didn't even really notice it because you kind of moved on to the next thing. But in that process of moving on to the next thing, we have all these other industries or occupations that popped up. And so this is not a picture of a place in front of my house in France, but in my house in France, across the street from me is a phone center repair shop. And it doesn't matter where I go in the world, there's always a phone center repair shop. And that's something that we never thought about in the past. There's a really nice paper from David Otter, an MIT economist, where he shows that 60% of the job titles that exist today in the United States didn't exist in 1940. So there's always this constant transformation in the world of work, and people move into other jobs. Now, that's not always a good thing for those people who lose their job because they have to follow that transformation, and that's not an easy process. So I don't want to minimize that change, but I think it is something important to reflect upon. So this is the case of switchboard operators, which is often evoked as the kind of quintessential example of automation that replaced the function. So switchboard operators, really the main task that they did, and their tasks really were concentrated on doing that mechanical attachment of the phone lines. When the phone system went to dial, the process was not that quick. Of course, technology moved slower back then, but the process wasn't that quick. So here's this is from a study that came out in 2024, actually studying switchboard operators. You see that there was a constant increase. There was some slowdown during the war because of restrictions on the use of copper, but then it went up. So not all of the switchboard operators lost their jobs from one day to the next, but it's clear that those that did lose their job, the studies showed that they actually did fare worse. A lot of them went into unemployment, or if they got new jobs, they got jobs at a lower pay. But the other people who were, let's say, equivalent in their skill level, similar characteristics, fared okay because there was expansion of the labor market. So a lot of this story is really about what the larger economic picture is. If you have a situation of economic growth, then it can absorb a lot of these job losses. But if you're in a situation where you're not going to have economic growth, then of course any of these automation type effects can be detrimental for people. Another example that's often given is automatic teller machines and bank tellers. So then when these started to be rolled out in the 1990s, and that's that kind of lower line on this curve here, there was a big fear that all bank tellers would lose their jobs. What we saw instead there was a transformation in the work that bank tellers did. So instead of just giving out banknotes, they moved into more of a kind of client services and giving advice to clients. And so there was actually an expansion of the number of bank services as the number of bank branches increased. This is something that has changed in the past 15 years. There's actually been a decline in the number of bank tellers now, but it's still a story of something that didn't happen from one day to the next. But the big question that I have is, okay, so new jobs are created, and we know this, we see this, we have all these social media marketing people and obviously web designers from before, but even influencers, all sorts of new jobs that have come about. But what is the quality of these new jobs? And one of the new jobs that's been important for AI is the training of AI systems. All of the people who kind of label AI, who label the pictures or label the information and who tag it and who train these AI systems. This is a huge job, occupation around the world now, but the quality is actually quite poor. And so the studies that we've done at the ILO and also other studies that have been done from many NGOs and researchers across the world show that they earn very little. Most of them are not employed in a standard employment relationship. It's very insecure, and they have no labor protections. So a big fight is, a battle is, how can we ensure that whatever the new jobs that are going to be created are going to be good quality jobs? So I want to turn now just to show you some numbers that we did at the ILO. We thought it was important in all this debate about AI's impact on the world of work to have some global numbers on what could possibly be some of the effects, and also to use a methodology that could encompass kind of the global picture and not just be a reflection of North America or Europe. So what we did, and we published this in 2023, and then we issued an update last year in 2025. I'm just going to explain very quickly the methodology, because I think in explaining the methodology, you'll understand a little bit more, a lot of the debate that sometimes is evoked in newspapers about the impact on jobs. So the way that economists have mainly approached this debate is knowing that jobs are a bundle of tasks. So when I go to work, I do a lot of different things. I might be speaking with you. I might be writing a research report. I might be talking to a colleague. I do all different things throughout my working day that you do as well. And what technology does is that it can replace certain of these tasks. So depending on how diverse the tasks are in your jobs, you're going to be more likely to be protected from automation. If it can only, let's say you have 10 tasks that you do, and it can only replace 3 of those tasks, that means that you still have 7 tasks less that you do in your job. Now, if you do just 1 or 2 things, and there can be a technology that can replace that, then you're more likely to lose your job. And this would be the case of the switchboard operators. And new technology was developed, and so you were more likely to be replaced. So using this approach of jobs are a bundle of tasks, what we used what was called the ISCO. The ISCO is the International Standard on the Classification of Occupations. It's actually developed at the ILO. The ILO is the Secretariat for the International Conference of Labor Statisticians, which brings together all of the national statistical offices around the world so that labor force surveys can be harmonized. We have the same questions so that you can compare unemployment rates between countries, for example. One of the things that they want to be able to compare is occupations around the countries. So according to the ISCO, the ISCO has the 1-digit level, which is kind of the big groups: managers, technicians, associate professionals, clerical support workers. And then there's the 2-digit, the 3-digit, the 4-digit level, which is more detailed. At the 4-digit level, there's a description of all of the tasks that a person does. And then what we did was that we actually used GPT technology to help us to derive a score for what would be the likelihood of each of those tasks to be automated from 0 to 1. So here is the example of a primary school teacher. So that's the ISCO code 2341. And these are some of the tasks that a primary school teacher does. So preparing daily and long-term lesson plans in accordance with curriculum guidelines. And so what we did is that we'd asked GPT to assign a score from 0 to 1 and to provide a justification. And then we did a human review of this. And then in 2025, we made it a little bit more sophisticated, but I won't get into that. But you can read about it on the papers if you want. So for this example of preparing daily and long-term lesson plans, it assigned a score of 0.6, and it gave this justification about why it gave that score. On the bottom example there, maintaining discipline, it assigned a very low score of 0.15. This is another way to look at the data. I don't expect you to read that. It's just to show you a little bit how it goes from this tree. So it expands into that. So that top one with the red is clerical office workers. And then those are all the different tasks. And then the color coding is how likely you would be, is that risk of automation of that particular task. And this is another way to look at the data. So for each occupation, we have these 10 tasks, and then they're plotted from 0 to 1 on the likelihood of being automated. And what you can see here on the bottom We have clerical support workers, and that is the category where we see the greatest risk of automation because they had more tasks that are closer to that number one. Whereas if you look at the one above it, managers, you have a few tasks that they do that could be automated. So there's something there, but then there's a lot of other tasks that they do that can't be automated. And that makes, intuitive sense. So the next thing we did was then we take for every occupation, we take the average score and then its standard deviation, or you think of it as dispersion. Again, how concentrated are there tasks in those categories that could be automated? And this is the result we get. And this is available online. You can actually mouse over and it gives you all of the different occupations. So it's kind of a nifty little tool. This is just for generative AI technology. So this is not including the use of AI in robotics. This is just generative AI. So there is certainly a limitation there. That's another work that we need to do. But what we find really is that it's those occupations in the dark red, kind of on the bottom right, where you have this kind of higher average score and more concentration of tasks that could be automated. And then you have a lot of other occupations that, yes, there's some tasks that they do that could be automated, but many other tasks that they do that can't be automated. And this is where that kind of notion of augmentation comes into play. So in the ideal scenario, the technology automates all the things that I don't want to do at work, and it leaves me time to do all these great things. Now, whether that happens in practice is a whole nother question, but that is kind of the discussion about, this would be augmenting them. So it leaves humans to do maybe more creative things or the more interpersonal things, and it automates the routine tasks. It doesn't always happen that way, but that's kind of the story. But the main message that what we try to convey in our work, though, is that, okay, so it's not a chicken little, the sky is falling kind of situation. We don't have that many jobs that are in this category of, huge risk of automation. But what we do have is a situation where there are a lot of jobs where there is a potential for integrating generative AI, and whether that integration is positive or negative really depends on how this process is managed. So that's, and especially from a labor union perspective, that's really important because this dialogue about technological incorporation at the workplace is important for having positive or negative results. I think I'll skip over this. Okay, so here is just another way to look at the data. This is comparing, here you can see the clerical support workers have the orange bar, so they're the ones that are most at risk. Blue is more of a, definitely a risk, but more low. And you can see the kind of the managers, professionals, technicians, and associate professionals that have kind of more blue tasks, let's say. So again, some potential for use of the technology, but not a full replacement. And then if we do the analysis by sectors, the sectors that we find that are most at risk are finance and insurance activities and information and communication technologies. And then it goes down depending. So the red is really those ones that are most that have the greatest risk. So now the next thing we did was we have this data for occupations and their risk scores, let's say. And then we use the employment numbers. So at the ILO, we have micro data sets from 140 countries in the world. So with that, we were able to model global estimates of what could be the impact. And so we did this by region of the world. And we also did this by countries' level of income, whether high income, upper middle income, low income, lower middle income, or low income. So the first thing that you'll notice is if you compare high income countries, that's where I have the red circle around, with low income, so on that same column, but all the way at the bottom, you'll see that the impact is much less in low income countries. Excuse me, I shouldn't even say, I'm using the word impact, and that's incorrect. It's really the exposure to the technology, because we don't know if it's going to be incorporated. So the reason the exposure is much less in low income countries is because low income countries have a very different economic activities, very different labor market composition. You have many more people in agriculture, you have many more people in transport, food vending. And because we're looking here at generative AI technology, these are not technologies that would affect those occupations. So that's why you have those low scores. This does not consider all of the other bottlenecks that could impede the use of the technology at the workplace, also in high income countries. So it doesn't include, but particularly in lower income countries, it doesn't account account for lack of electricity or unreliable electricity, unreliable broadband, lack of digital skills, the cost of the technology. Technology is not cheap. Do you actually have information that's digitalized that you could actually use this technology? Because if you don't have digitalized information, you can't use this technology. Do managers know how this technology works? Do they know how to incorporate it? Do workers know how to use it? These are all questions that one needs to reflect on to think before there's actually a decision to incorporate the technology at the workplace. So that's not accounted for here. This is just the exposure. This is basically just a reflection of the occupational structure and those occupations that are most at risk from the technology. So what you'll notice here is that the high-income countries most at risk, again, a reflection of the labor market diversification of these countries. And the other main thing that you'll notice is that women are much more exposed. And so 9.6% of female jobs are in that red category, compared with 3.5% of male jobs. And that's really a reflection of women's overrepresentation in clerical support jobs, which for us is the really main category that's at risk here. And this is another way of looking at the data. This is by women and men. This is actually this was taking jobs that are female dominated, where 75% or more of the occupation is done by females versus jobs that are male dominated, 75% or more of the occupation is done by men. These are actually global numbers. And then you can see that in the bottom is those four gradients that we have of exposure. And you can see that women are much more exposed as a result of it. So that has important policy implications. Okay, so that is about exposure. Let's talk a little bit about the use of Gen AI at work and what we know about it. So this is from an NBER study that came out in 2024. It was a representative sample of American workers and how they're using Gen AI at work. And we see that they're using it for writing communication. So it really seems it's basically a lot of a kind of co-pilot to write your emails, unfortunately, performing administrative tasks, translation, summarizing, coding. This is, a little bit kind of writing functions that this is the way they're using it. We actually took this survey and we applied it to Poland, and we worked with the Polish government, and we published a report in Polish. Unfortunately, we haven't published it in English yet, of the use of Gen AI at work by Polish workers. And this is from a nationally representative sample. This was done in November, December of 2024. So in Poland, 30% of workers have used Gen AI at work. Of that number, 16.7% have used it at least one working day last week or every working day. And this is somewhat similar to the American numbers. Big differences in terms of age. It's not really a surprise, I think, to anybody, but it's good to see the numbers. You'll see that between younger workers, 15 to 24 and 25 to 34, it's big use of Gen AI at work. So 38% of workers that are 25 to 34, in comparison to workers 55 to 64, you see 15%. So huge differences there, which of course has consequences for the future. Not much of a difference between the usage by men and women, which is different from the US survey, where actually there was a much greater use by men. In Poland, it seems to be somewhat equal. Okay, so another question we have is, have Gen AI tools been introduced by your company? So 9.4% said yes. So a lot of the people who are using it at work are using it out of their own, their own decision to use it. So they maybe have ChatGPT on their phone, or they just use it. But 9.4% are because it was introduced to the company. And then in 46.2% of the cases, it was introduced in consultation with employees. 42% and it wasn't. What's interesting that we found is that when it was introduced by the company, there's much greater usage of it, which is not surprising, but there's also a more positive reflection by the workers of that use. And so 66%, so 2/3 are, would you like more Gen AI tools to be introduced in your work than currently? So 2/3 respond positively to that. In contrast, when it wasn't introduced by the company, we have a much more negative reflection. So 41% are saying no, they don't want it to be used. 31% aren't really sure, but it's definitely a much more negative perspective there. And then has your employer developed guidelines regarding the use of Gen AI at work? And only 8% of the companies have, so very, very low levels. And are there any areas related to professional work where the use of Gen AI is restricted or prohibited? Only 2% said yes, which is really kind of shocking when you think of security risks for organizations that they don't have these guidelines in place. Okay, so turning to AI and working conditions. So in the workplace, and I alluded to this before, the introduction of AI the use of AI can be done by the worker's own volition, that they decide that they wanted to use it, or it can be management driven, or in what we think is the best case scenario, it can be jointly decided, ideally through some sort of participatory design on how we want to use this technology at the workplace and having mechanisms in place. So depending on is it imposed or whether it's coming from the worker, you can have a very different perspective on how technology plays out in the workplace. So this is from a case study that we commissioned. We're doing 4 different studies on the use of AI in the nursing profession. Brazil, South Korea, India, and Germany. This is from the South Korean study. And the South Korean study was really interesting because there was a lot of participatory design about the use of technology in the hospital that the researchers studied. And so what they found was kind of different scenarios. So the first one was, this isn't exactly AI, but there were these magic carts that kind of bring the supplies to the nurses. And this is something that had been agreed upon also by the nurses union and the hospital. And all of them were very happy with the way it was working. It was saving time. It was taking away a kind of a tedious and time-consuming task that the nurses were doing. But then there was also other technology that was imposed that wasn't working well, that they had it, but they ended up not using it. And that was the detection of wounds assessment and basically giving a score on how bad a wound is, such as bed sores, for example. They found that it was very hard to photograph the wound. It didn't really work well. It gave them information that wasn't good. The lighting wasn't good. So they didn't trust it. They stopped using it. They were still the junior nurses were still going to the senior nurses to ask their opinion on the wounds and what they should do with it. And then interestingly, there was a lot of push by the nurses who said they spent a lot of time explaining kind of very basic concepts to patients and their families that could actually be explained through some sort of kind of the tablet digital robot tool. And so they really pushed hard for this, but there was no interest by the hospital in doing that. So it's kind of a missed opportunity. There was kind of maybe it wasn't sexy enough to do that type of tool, whereas the wound assessment was more sexy, but it was ignored. And so it's just kind of an example of how the importance of really getting and following through with workers' perceptions of how technology should be incorporated at the workplace. Okay, so finally, this last point on managing AI's integration into the world of work. So when it comes to policy fallouts, although we don't really think that the sky is falling, there are some jobs that could definitely be affected, and we need to very much keep in mind that job displacement is a societal responsibility, particularly when it comes to technology. Nobody planned to be replaced by a robot or software, and so there is a need for governments to really strengthen social protection systems, ensure that workers have unemployment insurance, ensure that they can be retrained into other occupations that are possibly growing, whether these be in the care economy or the green economy, so that they're just not left out in the cold. The effects on job quality need to be managed. So from a regulatory perspective, there are certain red lines that need to be respected, particularly with respect to the fundamental principles and rights at work. So certainly discrimination and safety and health risks, those are fundamental rights at work that need to be respected. But then, of course, there's a really important role for collective bargaining in all of this, and having workers involved in the process through a consultation or ideally through participatory design. And this process works best when you have, obviously, stronger unions, when you have job security. We know, for example, that in the Nordic countries that workers there are less fearful of technology because they have these systems in place to to ensure that the technology is incorporated in a way that's positive for the workers, and also ensure that they have the protection that's needed in case they do lose their jobs. Or if you see in surveys of Southern European countries, the fear of technology is much, much higher. So collective bargaining in particular is a really flexible tool because it can respond to the specificities of the occupation or the sector when incorporating technology. This is not really something that can be, you can regulate for kind of these larger red lines, but really about incorporating technology at the workplace. It really has to be done at the sectoral level, or in some cases at the enterprise level, but really through collective bargaining is really a better tool for that. So thank you very much. And this is our observatory website if you want to see some of the papers that I referenced.
Thanks, Jenny. I'm just going to outline a bit of what we've been talking about actually offline before Janine gave the presentation, and it really comes down to how we take that information about where we are in the labor market at the high level view of who's at risk of being exposed to AI automation or augmentation, as you said. And I think it's really important as we sort of bring that down to the individual firm level, the employer level, especially as unions, is to look at the difference between what I would say are tools or craft tools and where augmentation happens, and industrial machines, which is really where replacement happens. And so if you sort of take your mind out of the generative AI piece and look at where we've seen automation over the previous century, you see that the augmentation piece is where it starts. It's where, and it happens at the tool level. So if you think of an auto plant or an industrial plant where there was a new technology that was brought in to support lifting heavy pieces and holding them in place so you could weld them to something else, that was an augmentation. It was a support for the work, and it's a tool essentially, a craft tool that the worker uses. The machine would be, when that tool is automated through a process of robotics and automation and software, that it's learned from that worker. So it's taken that organic knowledge the worker has and has implanted it into what used to be the tool that the worker used. And then you replace the worker with this new automated machine that actually does the replacement. And so the question, I think, for unions in this context, when we're trying to figure out who's exposed to this, is to see, are you exposed to the augmentation piece at this particular point in time and what that does? And you mentioned loss of skills, or I think Valerio did when he introduced the panel, or job quality, right? Changes the work environment. Augmentation can happen in a variety of different ways for a worker when you're dealing with a new tool. There's education, there's change in work environment, there's ways that you work, and it changes the process of work. And then it's a different thing when we're talking about replacement, when we're using industrial machines to replace people. And the corollary in the AI or generative AI system is people currently are using it as a tool. In fact, they're bringing it their own as a tool into their work environment by themselves. In some places, the employer is imposing the AI because they've been sold bill of goods by these companies. And then it's acting as a tool, but it's also facilitating, just like every other advanced tool in a workplace, it is surveilling you in a very not particularly good way and changing the work environment in that way. But the end goal, of course, of all that surveillance and your use of that tool is to automate a process. And that doesn't mean it's going to happen, but it does. That process of moving from a tool to an industrial machine is something that changes and puts tension on that workplace, on that work dynamic. So I'm wondering if you think that from the ILO's perspective, looking across sort of the world at different policies and laws, are we just able to leverage the current frameworks, the current laws, the current protections, and either make them better or whatever, or do we need new views or new processes to examine these processes? And I ask that because while previously we would probably have automation happening all the time in our workplaces, the AI is such a ubiquitous new technology, and it's happening in many workplaces all at the same time. Is that a concern for those institutions and those structures to deal with?
Okay,
so I told you it was going to be an esoteric question, so you better give it to the mic.
Yeah, so I think it's actually a really interesting reflection, and I think there's certainly some truth to it, particularly in certainly in certain physical work. If you have a support tool that then can provide the information that's needed to actually turn into a robot or some sort of machine that replaces the worker. I think whenever you have a technology that standardizes work processes, whether it be blue collar, white collar, pink collar work, then you're going to have more of a risk of replacement. If the more standardized your work can become, the more there is a risk of replacement. And so with Gen AI, people think, well, it's not standardized, it's creative work. And that is some truth to it, but it's not so much about the work that it's doing, but it's more about the processes that you have at the workplace. And if those can be standardized, where I see that you have this greater risk of replacement. And so I think it is a very ubiquitous technology that can be used in so many different ways that it's hard to find one answer to how it's going to affect people. But so to me, really the key is this standardization of work. And then the more standardized you are, the easier you'd be replaced, the easier you're also to be outsourced. Right. So you have some technology, for example, where they've replaced, you put cameras inside a retail shop, and there used to be security guards, or there's maybe a lot of security guards, but now there's just one security person, and you have cameras, and there's actually people in another country that are looking at the cameras and looking at the screens. And so it's just outsourced. So it's a job loss there, but it's not an aggregate job loss in a global perspective. The more that you can kind of make those processes standardized, the more you can outsource it or completely replace it. As far as laws and policy responses, I think it's really hard to have, to think that there can be legislation that can solve every one of these issues. And there's, unfortunately, the policy world is very complicated, and there's never any simple solution for policy responses. I think you really do need to have a layered solution, like I tried to say in my presentation. So you really need to have, you need to have the laws in the books that are going to provide at least a minimum support against some of the most egregious practices. But to actually have laws that you think are going to prevent the standardization processes, that's not going to happen. That is something that you're going to have to do, ideally through collective bargaining, to ensure at least it's done in a way that minimizes the harm to the workers, or that places those workers into another job, to doing different things and within a bigger organization, or at least that the government has some sort of at a minimum income support or training for the workers that do lose their jobs. So it's kind of an all hands on deck response to all of these challenges.
Right. I'll keep going.
Oh, she has
you're gonna go to the mic here would be helpful.
Mic check 1, 2, 2. Can I be heard? Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Honneur et plaisir. Munzungu is the name, AI policy researcher, but also former United Nations international civil servant. So I'll be quick but to the point. So first and foremost, thank you for the presentation. Absolutely impeccable. And I still want to stay in this context, but I want to shift a little bit, if I can, with humility. So I do want to ask this question. In the context of a new global economic order, is there an opportunity to bring forth a multipolar artificial intelligence governance structure to address the concentration of AI control in the hands of certain large tech monopolies? The reason why it's a question, because it's connected to AI, to work, and everything else in between. So I kind of want to get your perspective on that front. Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup.
Yeah, I mean, there is the concentration of AI in a few large firms is certainly a concern, particularly for countries that don't have the technology, who are perhaps sending sensitive data outside of their country, who can't control, who no longer have the control of the technology because they don't have that, because they don't have it in their country. So is there a possibility? I mean, I think there's certainly a possibility, and I think there has been push by countries in different parts of the world to try to have some sort of at least sovereignty with their data, or some sort of more sovereignty in the tech world. But I think a lot needs to be done still, particularly in the global South, where there's more limited resources. I think that is what needs to be done. I think relying on technology from other countries that you don't control is not a good path for development, because then you're always going to be at the behest of the technology firms or the other countries. So it's something that I think needs to be done. Whether all countries can do it is it's another story. Whether it's possible, but I think it's something that should be done.
Can I just continue on from that? I think it's interesting because you sort of said that the jobs that are at risk of being affected by AI are more densely or have a higher density in the global North. Is that income inequality that comes out of sort of where those jobs have shifted and the protections of those jobs, and then white collar jobs staying in the global North and industrial jobs being pushed out. Is that going to be exacerbated a lot? Do you think with these kinds of technologies? Because you mentioned that the technology is it's expensive. I mean, there's only a few countries in the world that can actually afford to build these data centers. The IP is very centralized. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's monopoly, but there's certainly a monopoly in area of the world that it's sort of centralized for that development, and it's really a rent. Right. Yeah. So that seems new in terms of a relationship between the global South and the global North. Is there a corollary, and do you think where that's going to go?
So I think there is a risk for developing countries. We have my colleague actually did a study with the World Bank looking at Latin America and the use of Gen AI. And the concern that we had there is that when we looked at those professions where there was high risk of automation, they took it one step further and looked at like the actual computer use at work. And so there were a lot of jobs there that could be automated. And a lot of these were kind of, if you think of a lot of the back office clerical work that has been pushed to the global South, that is a prime area that can be automated. And so there's a risk that a lot of these countries that have kind of developed, have created kind of an economic development plan based on back office work, now risking losing a lot of these jobs. And these are actually very good jobs in these countries. So there's that risk. But then there's also kind of, obviously our work, the ILO, is very much in this question of employment, where I think your question is a little bit broader in the sense that you're dealing with there's a lot of issues here that go beyond just employment. In terms of really national sovereignty and data sovereignty, which is a much bigger issue than just the kind of the employment effects. But I do think there are employment risks. Certainly, if you have a very low income country where you're not really even involved in global trade, then you're going to be pretty much protected from all this. It doesn't really matter. But you do have a risk that some of those really good jobs can disappear.
Yeah. So you can go back to the mic if you'd like. As you get up there, I'm reminded by your comments. I come from New Brunswick, and New Brunswick put a lot of money into call center development in the early 2000s, and that, of course, disappeared very quickly after it was sort of established in New Brunswick as a job development and IT services. So it's not just the global South; it's even in the country. Yeah, go ahead.
Round two. So
I'll try.
I'm sorry. So I did want to mention, I showed the where is it? Yes, the task level scoring, that aspect, right? And talking about the school teachers, gotta love teachers, right? They're really important. So with that being said, how did that particular study looked at the task you don't see. So when you think about a teacher, they teach. It's a lot of work. You're teaching the next generation, the future. Oh, okay. So how does that study mediate the task you don't see? The emotional intelligence, the emotional regulation, the ability to keep the attention in the classroom. Those tasks are not necessarily considered within that aspect of the study. I kind of want to gauge, how do you calculate that? And can AI replace it? Okay.
It doesn't, it can't, and that's a huge shortcoming. And it's a really good point that you bring. And that's also a lot of the reason why the technology doesn't work. Because people think, well, it can actually do X, Y, and Z, but actually your job is a lot more than just X, Y, and Z. So while the ISCO has a pretty good description of the tasks, there's always things that humans bring to their jobs that is never written down on paper that it can't account for. Technology can't account for that. So yeah, that's a huge limitation.
Yeah, thanks so much. John Weir, Canadian Association of Professional Employees. One of my questions is about sort of the disconnect between the promise to employers of AI and then sort of what AI can actually do in the implementation of that AI, right? So our members are federal government workers. As I'm sure a lot of people know, before Christmas, the government put down a budget. One of the big sort of silver bullets of this budget was that government was going to massively reduce costs by essentially laying off government workers and replacing a lot of those tasks with AI. One of the things we're finding is that the promise of replacing, I mean, we're still all going to lose, like our members are still going to lose their jobs, but the tasks that they're promising to replace can't actually be done by AI as it exists. So I was wondering if you could speak to this disconnect between, employers seeing AI as the silver bullet to labor costs, but then the fact that AI can't actually do necessarily the things that supposedly it will be able to replace human workers in doing.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's actually a perfect follow-up to your comment, which is that the technology seems often that it can do something that it can't really do because it's not really accounting for all of the different facets that one has in their job. And of course, this is, when you hear of organizations that, go full on and think that they can replace everybody and it doesn't work. And that's because they didn't go through this kind of participatory design process with their workers. Because if they did, they could actually incorporate it in a way that it responds really to the workers' needs. And it works effectively at doing what it's supposed to be doing. But when you think that, well, actually with this person, it's really dismissive of people's work if they think that there's just going to be a technology that can do it perfectly and solve all the issues. And they're just going to cause problems that are going to be expensive. And in the end of the day, the people who make out well are the people who sold the software. Yeah.
I'm going to go to the mic and then I've got a question from online and then I'll go back to them.
Good morning. I had to take a call and I came back in on the tail end of your presentation and you're talking about workers' involvement in the design. So hopefully my question you have not answered while I was out. My question is, could you extrapolate on the extent of and the nature of workers' involvement? And I ask that because I don't recall her name, but about 5 years ago, a senior executive at Google, a Black woman, resigned because she felt that they were not considering the issues of race in their technology. That's the first question. The second question is, are there, in the design of this technology, are there non-technological aspects being looked at? Psychiatrists, psychologists, sociologists, philosophers, ethicists. I'm a retired corporate counsel. I retired about 5 years ago, and I worked for a large North American multinational. After George Floyd, both beautiful and very sad, I remember a senior person in HR coming up to me and saying, could you look at some of our advertising, not as a lawyer, but as a Black person, which meant a couple of things. There weren't Black folks in the HR department to look at it. And it was beautiful in the sense that all of a sudden that thought was triggered, right? How are Black people being perceived in our advertising?
Yeah, so what I was trying to argue is really just the importance of, again, of getting that feedback. So if you can have a process where the workers are consulted, or even the workers take the initiative of how the technology goes into the workplace, you're going to have a much better output. I mean, that's kind of the basic argument, and this is where the participatory design comes in. And you have a long experience of that in as usual in the Nordic countries. But you also have work councils in Germany where the workers that sit on the works councils, when technology is integrated, they also have a say on the way the technology is incorporated, or at least in the decision to incorporate the technology. And when you can do that, you can avoid a lot of the problems. From a kind of broader ethical perspective, ideally, depending on who is participating in the design of this technology, you would have that as well. Whether that's happening or not, I mean, I think it depends on the particular context. The concern with the technology being adopted at workplaces today is that so much of the technology is off the shelf, and so it's not being designed at the workplace. And so then it's even worse because the managers of the companies that are buying the technology don't even have a good understanding of how it's being used. And so you see this in a lot of the recruitment software, in the use of AI in different human resource functions, where I have a paper actually with Hannah Johnston, who's sitting right in front of you, where we look at how AI is being used by human resource managers. And this is this real fear, because if you're buying off the shelf technology, it's being trained on data that might not reflect your organization. Managers don't really know what it means, but then they've spent all this money on the technology, so then they feel like they have to use it. So it just causes more and more problems. So the ideal situation would be that this kind of more technology designed at the workplace with the workers, and it's controlled, and they can override it when there's problems. Whereas if it's third party, you might not be able to override it, and you don't even know how to use it. So I always advocate when I give talks that it's not just about digital skills for workers, but it's also about digital skills for managers, because they really need to understand what they're buying and how it's being used.
I will say,
let's move with
Well, yeah, actually, we've got a couple of questions from online, so I'm going to stick one of those in just while we're waiting. We are seeing a qualitative case study level emerging, evidence that higher levels of trust and worker participation in the design and development of algorithmic management and other AI tech leads to higher levels of productivity. Are you aware of comparative, more qualitative data that supports these insights from the, I think they mean quantitative data that supports these insights from qualitative case studies? So this is around a question around productivity and whether or not we're actually seeing productivity gains in the workplace.
Should I just,
Yeah, for sure.
Since he's at the mic, maybe you could follow up, and then I'll go to that.
Yeah, just to two of the previous questions on the soft skills, the question about the teachers, there is someone I know who is working on that technology, right? About things like empathy, feelings, and I'm not privy to give his name, but he's in the same league as the Bill Gates and the Steve Jobs. I just want you to know there is that work is being done, because it is as important, people's feelings and reaction to things. So there are folks working on that technology.
Yeah. I don't know if you can really automate empathy effectively, but it's great that they're trying.
That's exactly what he's working on.
That's okay. Exactly I don't know if that makes me feel better, frankly, but so for what I think I understood in this question, so there have been some studies on particular occupations where they've used technology to see if they're more productive. So people writing papers, or you're doing kind of specific tasks, and then their productivity increases. Mm-hmm. And so some of them are kind of very interesting case studies that show this. Whether they hold true in the aggregate and whether they hold true in the long term, nobody knows yet. Yeah. But there are certainly some studies that show some positive impacts for productivity from the technology. So
on the coding side,
such as coding.
There was some study. I mean, this is a new field, of course, and there's not that much data on it. But there are some studies that also show that people think that they're more productive. Yeah. But then it turns out actually when you measure it, they're not. They're not, right? And it also depends on how where you are as a skill level when you're using the technology, and that changes how you feel about the technology as well. So all these things sort of interface and can cause those dynamics in the workplace as well, right? Because workers are fighting over whether or not to use the tool, how to use the tool, and then the employers are getting different kinds of feedback. If they're just listening to workers, sometimes they give the wrong answer, and then the data gives a different answer, but it can be interpreted differently. Anyway, we're still at the beginning stages, I think, of a lot of this on the productivity side, but absolutely.
Hi, thank you for that presentation, really interesting. I'm here from ACTRA, which is a union that represents artists and performers in Canada. And we've kind of been the canaries in the coal mine on this whole AI thing. I don't know why they've decided that our jobs are the first to go, but they seem to be able to monetize it a little easier than, say, curing cancer. One of our primary concerns, and this relates to what Graham was saying about surveillance of workers with the goal of organically replacing the worker, is that generative AI is being used to replace us, is being trained using data that infringes not only on our IP, but on our civil rights. And there's no requirement for consent or compensation for any of the data that is being mined to create these, whether it's a commercial or a movie or whatever is being done to replace our creative input to the world. Does the ILO have a position on the lack of regulation on training the AI agents and LLMs? And then is there an economic model for compensating workers for training their own replacements?
So no, the ILO does not have a position on this. We don't really deal with copyright issues. I think there are some discussions at the WIPO, which is the World Intellectual Property Organization, and also the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union. I think there are some discussions there on that topic, but we don't deal with that. We did put out a brief on AI in the media and culture industries, looking a little bit more at some of the responses. So, for example, the responses of SAG-AFTRA and the collective agreements that they had signed in this area as possible ways of addressing some of these issues. This is certainly a big problem, and you're absolutely right, because they're able, the technology is able to produce creative pieces based on all of the creative pieces that everybody's produced. My husband's a painter, and he keeps posting his art, and I keep saying, would you stop posting your art? I mean, it's really, it's on the one hand, they have to do it for marketing, and yet, that if I asked AI to produce a painting in his style, it could do that. So it's a real problem. And I think maybe that is probably an area where government response is really important. It's a little bit out of the domain of the ILO, but certainly I think it is an area because, it wouldn't exist if all of the artists hadn't produced all of the work over all these many decades. I think the one silver lining is that people are still going to go to live music concerts. People will still like human interaction. There was some piece that came out in a symphony where there was a mechanical cello that played. I have no interest in going to watch a mechanical cello play. so I think there are some limitations, but of course it is a real threat.
Just a question. I'll go to online and then we'll go back to the mic. Here's a question from Sri Lanka from the online. How do you think that collective bargaining is going to work in the cases of the Global South worker and companies that are big tech multinational corporations in the Global North, specifically in the case of a digital labor platform or web-based work, that kind of thing? So I guess they're asking, how do we enforce those labor rights, which is the age-old question about outsourcing, but in this particular context.
Yeah, so that's certainly a really tricky issue, and it's something that the ILO has thought about a lot. And in fact, we're having a normative discussion at the ILO, a standard-setting discussion on decent work in the platform economy. It started last June, and there'll be the follow-up discussion will be this June. Hopefully, ILO constituents will move forward on something that could be protective of some of these workers on digital labor platforms, given the well-known gaps in labor protection that exist. But yeah, it is the same problem that we see in supply chains in general, where the worker on the ground has a hard if they're not getting their labor rights or labor benefits, it's a hard time. It's very difficult for them to have redress mechanisms when there's a chain of production.
We'll go to the mic here.
Je vais parler en français.
OK. Je pense que ça,
Que le monde mette là.
ça va.
Ça va pour toi?
Oui, c'est pas. Je sais pas l'accent québécois, c'est un peu difficile pour moi, mais.
L'accent québécois de Chicoutimis, avec ça peut être difficile. Je vais me présenter. Mon nom, c'est Alain Deck. Je suis un président du local 700 Unifor et aussi je siège sur l'exécutif pour le transport routier. Donc, vous avez dit quelque chose durant votre présentation au niveau des manufactures que oui, on peut déplacer des jobs quand les robots rentrent puis tout, mais je vais vous donner certains exemples, puis après ça, j'aimerais savoir votre opinion. Puis je vais aller plutôt vers le transport parce que je vois souvent aux États-Unis, on débarque à l'aéroport, puis on embarque, puis il y a un taxi qui est là, mais il n'y a pas de chauffeur. Fait que ça s'en vient de plus en plus populaire dans certains aéroports. Puis ça, c'est des bonnes jobs. Et on se fait... Ce monde-là perd leur job, puis c'est des robots qui les prennent, puis sont durs, tu sais, ces personnes-là sont dures à se replacer à quelque part dans la société, qui mènent d'autres problèmes. Puis ça continue aussi parce que là, dernièrement, en Europe, je sais, en Chine, sont en train de faire des tests au niveau des trucks, donc des 55 pieds qui vont faire la même chose, vont pas avoir de chauffeur. Je trouve ça un peu dangereux aussi, mais ça va être la même chose. Puis au niveau des manufactures, ici au Canada et surtout au Québec, moi, au local 700, j'ai 42 lieux de travail, donc je vois beaucoup. J'ai des chandelles, j'ai de la dynamite, j'ai du plastique, j'ai plein de places. Puis je vais juste vous donner un exemple d'une de mes places. C'est un lieu de travail de plastique, puis ils font des piscines. OK? Là-bas, j'avais 175 membres qui travaillaient. Aujourd'hui, j'en ai 80. Et qu'est-ce que l'employeur a fait? Il a fait un test. Il a pris une machine où pour faire tout l'exercice, pour faire une pièce, ça prenait 5 personnes. Puis là, c'est des mains, des robots qui font toute la job. Puis quand vous avez dit, ben, on déplace le monde, on peut regarder nos conventions collectives, puis essayer de mettre un peu plus sur l'intelligence artificielle pour déplacer. On a déjà dans beaucoup de nos conventions au niveau du changement technologique. Puis là, on peut former la personne, mais à un moment donné, là, on fait quoi? Parce que c'est 5 jobs qui partent, puis d'habitude, l'employeur va embaucher un technicien ou quelqu'un qui est déjà concentré sur cette tâche parce que c'est tout du monde, un peu comme moi. Moi, depuis l'âge de 16 ans, je travaille avec mes mains. OK? À l'école, j'étais pas très, très bon, mais avec mes mains, j'étais bon. J'ai travaillé dans des manufactures toute ma vie, mais en ce moment, je suis chanceux, je suis privilégié parce que j'ai été capable de me concentrer puis devenir président de mon local, puis je fais d'autres choses. Mais ce monde-là, sur le plancher, les 5, l'exemple que je vous montre, puis quand je vais visiter l'usine, puis le directeur me dit « Regarde comment que ça va bien, ça. » Il rentre jamais malade, lui. Il est tout le temps là. Hein? Des fois, il y a besoin d'un petit ajustement, un peu d'huile, c'est tout. Fait que l'exemple là, il le fait avec un autre, il le fait avec un autre, avec un autre. Ce monde-là, là, on peut pas les placer, on peut pas dire on va essayer de les placer parce que peut-être qu'ils n'ont pas les formations pour ou sont comme un peu comme moi, c'est des travailleurs avec des mains. Puis on voit ça souvent que ça commence à grossir, que on se demande pourquoi on a autant de monde peut-être sur la rue, puis tout ça. Puis ça fait partie de ça parce que le plus que ça se passe, ce monde-là ne va plus être capable de se placer nulle part, puis notre société va changer totalement. Donc, ma question pour vous, c'est où est-ce qu'on met la ligne? C'est quoi votre opinion? Comment qu'on peut mettre la ligne pour arrêter ça? Qu'il y ait tu sais, oui, AI, là, l'intelligence artificielle, là, on va pas se cacher, ça rentre partout, puis on n'a pas le choix, ben. Mais l'exemple que je vous sors là, de ma place de plastique, là, je vous dis peut-être dans 5-6 ans, je vais avoir 10 personnes qui vont travailler là. Parce que les caristes, c'est devenu des robots, là. Il n'y a personne dessus. Ils s'enlignent, ils savent où aller chercher tout. Fait que c'est quoi votre opinion? Où est-ce qu'on met la ligne sur ça?
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly if you're working in a factory where you can automate what the people are doing, and the factory is only doing that one thing, and there isn't a possibility to put the worker into a different post within the organization, then unfortunately you're going to be in a situation where you're going to have the job losses. I mean, that is the reality, and that is the sad reality of it. I do think, I mean, in an aggregate picture, you will have new jobs that will be created. Even if you think of, I mean, you mentioned the driverless taxis. As it stands right now, there are more people that watch these, because there's really more remote control taxis. There are more people that watch these screens than there actually are the drivers themselves. So right now it's not so much labor saving. Eventually it probably will be. But there are a lot of new jobs that are created in terms of the people who develop the software, the people who have to install the machinery, make sure the machinery is maintained. So there are new jobs that are created, but that's not, of course, not something that's going to be positive for that person, that that individual who has lost their job in the factory. That's hardly a compensation for them, because they're probably not going to be the person who's then going to be designing the equipments. So for those situations where people are do unfortunately lose their job, the only option really is that there be robust unemployment insurance systems in place, and that there be some sort of training policies in place, long-term training policies in place to put them into other positions in the economy. Because unfortunately, yes, there are some jobs that do get lost.
Merci, madame.
Merci à vous.
So we'll go back to a question from online. It's from someone from the University of Leeds. What role do unions need to play in upskilling their membership in order to engage meaningfully in a participatory design process? So I'm thinking, engaging not just in terms of upgrading skills, but actually engage at a level so they can talk coherently about this issue.
Yeah, no, so I think that's really important. I think that there needs to be more kind of awareness raising on some of the risks, limitations, opportunities, and that it also really is important for unions to reflect a little bit about the technology and understand what they're negotiating at the bargaining table on these topics. That they just, they can't be complacent with this topic. That they really do need to increase their understanding. Absolutely.
Thank you. Hi, Christopher Garrett. I'm with Unifor, out of the rail sector, chair of the Rail Council. I'm curious to know if there's any studies done or any information out there as to the cost of AI when it comes to social programs. Like your example of the switchboard operators took about 60 years for that job to go from everyone being human to being completely replaced. Mm-hmm. Now, at the rate that that gives society a certain amount of time to absorb them. Now, at the rate that AI is being developed and replacing, say, clerical or call center. I mean, I recently had an issue with my home internet and had to fight with an AI chatbot for about 5 to 10 minutes before I could get it to actually connect me to a person. Is there any information as to what the cost is for all the people that are going to be losing their jobs? And it is, in that shortened time to say an EI program and the taxpayers around the world, and versus the money that's saved by companies, and they're off shifting it to society and taxpayers to support these people, same as with having to retrain them, the cost of retraining and all that. Is there any information out there on that that's being studied right now?
Yeah, no, I mean, I wish we had that kind of information, but unfortunately we don't, which is not a very satisfactory answer. But I think, just in your question, I think you outlined some of the secondary effects that do need to be thought about when people go head on into incorporating technology. And that's something also that the public sector needs to think about too, because if they're displacing workers, there's also a cost to the public sector of the displacement of the workers from the technology. The call center example is interesting. We have Virginia Dolgas is in the room, and she has a paper with some of her colleagues looking at call centers around the world, and I really like that study that they did. And you said that you had to fight with the robot, and eventually you got a human. So there's still some humans because there's still a need for the humans at some point. But the problem is that when you got the human, at this point, I don't know if you were angry at the person, but at this point, everyone's so angry that those poor humans that are now taking the calls, their job quality has decreased because people are so much more irate when they finally get to talk to a human. I've also heard in the call center area that there's also an expansion in that market of customer service call center work, because so many more things are digitized now that you need more and more now people to kind of resolve some of these issues. So overall, it's not complete. I mean, it does look like it's definitely gonna have some job losses, but overall, the market is actually increasing in that area, apparently, from what I've heard. Yeah. Thanks.
I'll just add that one of the other costs is the amount of time you spent.
Oh yeah, sure.
on the call. No one's measuring that, and in fact, a lot of the chatbots are designed to download that work onto you,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
To figure out your own mistake, essentially using a digitized FAQ system, and then to annoy you so much that you give up. Right?
Yeah, and then it's also the case with self-service checkouts, which you got rid of that worker, but now we're doing the work. So the work didn't disappear; it just got pushed onto us.
Yeah. Just before we'll go and back online, just because it came in before you got up there, what is the role of labor regulations and industrial policy going forward? How can we better bridge the siloing of labor relations issues and regulation within labor departments, presumably within government, whereas AI and innovation issues are better resourced. Are they better resourced in industrial departments? Are they better resourced at the individual firm level? Like where is that tension actually going to be solved?
Yeah, I mean, so we see in a lot of governments that they tend to have a kind of a ministry for digital affairs or a ministry for innovation, and then there's a ministry of labor, and they're not always in communication. So certainly within government, more communication within these ministries is really critical for kind of developing policies that can address a lot of these issues.
Hi there. Thank you very much. This has been very informative. Corey Doran, I have a question in regards to the AI implementation and the International Labour Organization stance on the protected sectors. I know we've talked about education several times. We are now facing the first time in human history where the generation that is coming up right now is going to be dumber than the generations beforehand. It's not a joke. It's actually backed up by hard data. And why that is, it's directly tied to the implementation of digital technology in the classroom. So Scandinavian countries, for example, have scaled it back. And so you can see the test scores skyrocketing. We know that all the tech billionaires, none of their kids have tablets. They all go to private schools where everything's written on a chalkboard with pen, paper, or pencil. We saw how teachers or the education system can be in a very exposed area. What about the conversation of we shouldn't do this at all? It's very clear that the more access to the internet, the more destructive it is for kids. We're seeing European Union and we're seeing other countries banning social media until you're 18. I think that tells us it's as dangerous as a gun. It's as dangerous as cigarettes and alcohol in someone's hands. How are we allowing this to be unfettered, to use our kids as guinea pigs for this? You're going to have the dumbest first world nations in the world soon because we are not giving them the ability to be resilient. We're not teaching them this, and you have it mandatorily imposed on large labor sectors. Where's the conversation about should we be doing this? So I went to the Jeffrey Hinton lectures, and Dr. Ian Owens, he was talking about how we need to treat AI like nuclear power. This is not something for everyone to just be ramshackling into their business. This is something that has immense potential, but immense destructive potential. We talked about race. We know that inherently AI systems are large language models are based on what exists on the internet, which is racist drivel for the most part. So we know that there are enormous problems. Why aren't there larger stands of these should not be rolled out into certain protected sectors? You know, in healthcare, it's very important that we have that conversation, but we've also had conversations with lead AI analysts and implementers for the healthcare system who say this is extremely dangerous and racial bias is real in these large language models. And we know that, and yet we're still allowing it to go forward. So where does the ILO, where do any of these organizations stand on protecting certain sectors where we go, that's just not something that should happen? I would say kids being one of the largest ones. I mean, we've exposed them to something that none of us were exposed to at all growing up. I mean, they have access to the most deplorable images at any and all points in time, and there's no legal protection for their images being protected, as we're seeing from EU threatening to bar, X Grok, because it has the absolute inability and no ethical implementation whatsoever on its use. So where do we stand? I think larger unions and places need to gather together and say, no, we're not okay with this standard. Because as we go, you give an inch, you give a mile, and we are giving miles to begin with here on our rights. Where does the ILO stand on those issues?
So I think what you're bringing up goes way beyond the ILO. The ILO doesn't have a position on this, so I can't speak on behalf of the ILO on that question. I can answer it as a mother. I completely agree with you. There's a lot of real concern with a lot of the technology in our society, and this is really more a societal issue. We're at ILO, we're focused more on the employment, job quality. We're not getting into these kind of bigger debates. But yeah, I think society needs to reflect a little bit about these questions and whether there are positive, whether really the positive uses that do exist, whether it's worth it, whether that trade-off is worth it. In education, I think the latest results in Finland is actually their PISA scores dropped because they were introducing technology. So now they're going to scale back. And it's certainly the case that, yeah, I see it myself. My French writing is very poor. And so I end up using all this AI to do my French writing. And so now my French writing doesn't improve because I keep using these translators. So, I mean, if you use these tools, you don't learn. It can help you if you want to kind of take a shortcut on something, but in a long term, you're not going to learn. So there is a problem, and I think it's definitely a problem in education. And of course, there's bigger societal problems about, should Grok be able to show nude pictures, and what are the environmental costs of this? I mean, I think those are reflections that our elected leaders need to be acting on. But until society and citizens actually stand up against this, nothing will be done.
Couldn't large labor movements, though, also make statements saying it would be time to stand up and make decisions?
I'm sure that, yes, certainly the labor movement could do that if the labor movement wants to do that. The ILO is a tripartite organization. We have employers, workers, and governments as our membership.
Gotcha.
So you'd have to have tripartite agreement on that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I think this is probably our last question. Did you want to? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Jensen. I'm with Unifor. I was curious about we're seeing an increasing amount of companies utilizing external kind of consulting firms to identify opportunities for workforce reduction as well as budget cuts. I'm wondering if you're seeing AI being used by companies that do that sort of consulting and review to identify essentially workers' value in a workplace, not only the potential for replacement, but also the potential for example, a job that's currently being done by 5 people potentially being done by less people.
I don't know firsthand, but I think that is probably happening. But the question is whether the metrics that are being given are actually, do they really encompass what the person does? And I think that's probably the bigger question about whether, one can think that you can replace those 5 people with 1 people and that they'll make up for it, but it might not work out in practice.
So I think this will be the last question that's from online. Do you believe that collective bargaining process between employers and employees could substitute in the coming future on an international level the more institutionalized process of lawmaking in the field of AI and work? For example, instead of the EU regulation or directive or US Congress law, could we have a relevant international law coming from the collective bargaining process? Is that sort of like a sectoral, but even bigger kind of agreements between employers and the unions?
I mean, in theory, yes. The problem is that you don't have collective bargaining in a lot of places, and so it really depends on what your unionization rates and the industrial relations system, and whether you have the collective bargaining in place to also even to negotiate in these areas. In some places, collective bargaining doesn't even get into these issues, but it's certainly collective bargaining. I personally think is a better tool here, just because how technology and really AI or technology in general is used in the workplace really depends very much on what that workplace does. So that's why I say it's really hard to regulate a lot of these things kind of with broad-based regulation, because they're, some questions are very specific.
Right.
But global collective bargaining, in retrospect, you could think of some of the ILO standards are in a sense global they're not really, but they are the outcome of tripartite negotiations. So at least you do have the parties discussing these issues. And so that helps. And that is why the ILO is tripartite. But there isn't a way to have kind of a global collective bargaining agreement.
Europe sort of has some.
Yeah, Europe does. Yeah. And I guess you have also international framework agreements also for some sectors that maybe could help as well.
Right. So the ITF, for example, the International Transport Federation has such. Well, thank you very much. We've come to the end of the session. Thank you. It was a very informative session, and thank you to the audience for taking the load off and answering or asking all those great questions. I think we're going to now lead to a quick or a break, a refreshment break. So we'll see you back in 15 minutes back in the room for the next session. So thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. If I can have your attention, please. We're about to start our first panel. You have to be more assertive. So we'll start tomorrow. We'll just stand up. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Bonjour tout le monde. I'm very pleased to be here today to moderate our first panel, State of Things, Surveillance Monitoring in the Contemporary Workplace. My name is Ida Abraham. I'm a doctoral researcher at Osgoode Hall Law School focusing on workplace surveillance. Prior to pursuing my doctoral studies, I worked as an employment labor lawyer here in Toronto, Canada. I'm honored to guide this very important conversation today. I'm joined here by three distinguished legal scholars or experts who will be helping us unpack both the issues and concerns related to surveillance monitoring tools in modern day workplace. To my left, from management side, we are very fortunate to have Amy Tibble. Amy is a partner at Hicks Morley, a management side labor firm in Toronto. Amy advises employers on a variety of matters related to AI in the workplace, employment law, human rights, and labor relations. She has extensive litigation experience and has appeared at all levels of court in Canada and before a wide variety of tribunals. She advises clients across the country as well as US-based clients with operations in Canada. Welcome, Amy. We also have, I'm very pleased to introduce Deanna Simonovic, who will offer the union perspective. Deanna is the senior legal counsel with Unifor and has 24 years of experience in labor, employment, and human rights law. She advises and advocates on behalf of unions and workers across Canada. Her work focuses on the use of surveillance and monitoring technologies in the transportation sector, particularly trucking, examining how AI-enabled tools such as in-cab cameras, GPS tracking, and electronic logging systems affect truck drivers' privacy, working conditions, and human rights. And we're also very fortunate to have Dr. Philippa Collins from the UK. Philippa is a senior lecturer in law at the University of Bristol. Her research critically examines how artificial intelligence, algorithmic management, and workplace technologies affect labor rights and human rights at work. She has published peer-reviewed research paper, contributed a book chapter on AI and human rights at work, and co-authored a policy report recommending new rights for workers in the era of algorithmic control. She's also the author of a book titled Putting Human Rights at Work, Labor Law, the ECHR, and the Employment Relations, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2022. In addition, Philippa has also provided written evidence to the UK Parliament's AI governance inquiry, all engaging deeply with legal challenges posed by AI and workplace surveillance technologies. So we are very honored to have all three panelists with us today and to share their insights. So the goal of this panel is to offer a forward-looking discussion on workplace surveillance and monitoring in modern day workplace. We will begin with a broader contextual question to frame the discussion, and then proceed to more specific issues, including illustrative real-world examples. We will then open the floor to audience questions and comments towards the end of the session. So to begin, I'd like to invite each panelist to offer a brief opening reflection, about 3 to 4 minutes, on the current state of workplace surveillance. Panelists, in your remarks, please consider the following. How would you characterize workplace surveillance today? How has it expanded beyond traditional tools such as security cameras? And what key challenges do these newer forms of monitoring raise? And finally, what do you see as the 3 most significant concerns associated with these emerging surveillance technologies? Thank you. I'd like to invite Amy to start.
Great. Can everybody hear me okay? I'll use my outside voice. Thanks again for inviting me to participate today. So as was said a moment ago, I represent exclusively employers. And so in labor and unemployment, and as you can imagine, it's primarily employers that implement surveillance mechanisms and use AI software in various places within the workplace and for various functions. So I'll keep my opening statements to the questions as directed. First question was, how do we view the current state of the workplace and surveillance in the workplace? And to that end, keep in mind that I operate primarily in Ontario, although I do venture outside our borders. I do stay out of Quebec. We're not allowed to play in Quebec. Quebec is an entirely different legal system for those that aren't familiar, and it's best that common law lawyers don't play in the civil law industry. So with that in mind, every province has its own rules and regulations, and so I'm going to be primarily opining and providing information about Ontario. So in Ontario, I think the current challenge that we have is there is some development in the law happening, and that has happened. Case law is very slow. There is a very significant gap in where we can look to for some guidance from whether it's the courts or arbitrators or various tribunals. They're just not there yet. And then the other item that I would flag at this point is that many employers, and I would say, you know, other components within an organization. So it's not just your employment managers or supervisors, for example, but many companies, let's say, are really excited about AI. They're very excited. They want the newest, they want the latest. They read an email, they read an article, and they want it. And that's great. I want a lot of things, and that doesn't mean I'm going to get them. And what I find is missing to some extent is the requirement to take a step back, right? Take a step back, evaluate the tool. I always ask our clients, what do you want it for, right? Is it a need to know, or is it a nice to have? Again, if it's a nice to have, that's going to go in one bucket. If it's a need to have, then we really need to go through and do an analysis as to why that's the case. I've sort of coupled into my last answer, the next answer to the second question. So the major challenges, though, that I find that I encounter and many companies encounter, and I would say unions and plaintiffs' counsel encounter as well, is the nature of the tools. So are you collecting this much data, but really you're trying to ensure that the company vehicle is used for company business for the purposes of insurance premiums, right? Or are you collecting every single thing that is done in this vehicle for a 24-hour period? Meaning you have to figure out what is it that you actually need to have. And that analysis I'm finding isn't always done at the beginning, at the right time, which is before you go and you purchase the license for the software.
As far as the top 3 concerns that I run into, we're going to talk about a number of them today, but what I'm running into, one I've already flagged, which is everybody wants the new and shiny tool, but they're not doing the fulsome analysis as to, do I need it? And what is it? And is there another way of getting this that isn't quite as intrusive, for example? But then on the back end, when a company has installed or is elected to use certain software, the question that always comes to my mind is not only what are you gathering, but where is it? Right? Is it stored on a bunch of servers in California? Is it stored for a certain period of time? How do you get it deleted? Right? What are your retention policies? How long are you keeping this data? And that is a question that every organization, whether it's an association or whether it's an employer or a company, whatever it is, needs to stop and take stock of. Because particularly if that data is stored off-site or outside of what I'll say the Canadian jurisdiction, it now is subject to foreign laws. And so, sorry, I probably went over 4 minutes, but those are my questions or my answers to the questions.
Okay, great, thank you. And Diane, we'll go Diane and then Philip.
Okay. So to answer the first question, I think we already talked about it earlier this morning, but the workplace surveillance tools or what's happening right now is so different than just a camera, right? So we have GPS monitoring, tracking, video cameras, we have card swipe tracking, productivity software. So there's all kinds of surveillance tools out there. And so one of the major challenges with these tools is just the variety of them and the different industries and the different workplaces that they are in, and how do we regulate such a broad spectrum. And I think earlier when we spoke with the ILO, maybe the answer is that we can't regulate all of that. And then we have other workplace laws in Canada and in the different provinces that address different aspects of it. But perhaps at the end of the day, and we'll come to this later, in my opinion, the best parties to address it are the parties on the ground level, and that being trade unions and workers and employers together working in conjunction with the legislation and regulators to set the boundaries of monitoring today. The other major challenges, I think, is the impacts on workers' working conditions. So just the tools are much more invasive of employee privacy. They have major impacts on the quality of work, and we have tools that are pushing for efficiency, but at the same time causing extreme stress, burnout, unsafe conditions for workers. Another challenge that Amy brought up and I see with the new tools is the data piece of it, just the scope and magnitude of data that's being collected. Where is it being collected? How is it being saved? And how is it being, and we'll talk about this as well later, but the lack of consent for that data and people really understanding what personal information of theirs is being collected and where is it going, and having any ability to say no to that. And then the other challenge I see with the monitoring tools of today and the where surveillance is going with AI and everything is the complicating collective bargaining. So our collective bargaining relationships are between the trade unions, workers, and employers. And now we have the introduction of these third parties, and these third parties being in other jurisdictions, not on our Canadian soil. And they're designing the software, they're setting the parameters and things that are affecting our workers on a day-to-day basis, but we don't have direct relationships with them, and we can't necessarily control, or should we be able to, or how do we control? So those are kind of my big picture, most challenging things about the where we're going today with surveillance.
Okay, great. Thank you, Deanna. And Philippa?
Thanks to Valerio and to Ada for really generous sharing and some really excellent questions that you've set out for us today, and for some really interesting initial reflections. So thank you for kind of introducing some of the tools that we're talking about. And it's worth thinking about the consequences of some of those kinds of tools, where you can gather many more data points about an individual and how they're interacting with their devices and with their environment, their physical location. So we're dealing with much more just pure mass of information about individuals. And we're also able to track routinely on, if we wish to, of course, on a kind of moment by moment basis, which was kind of unheard of 20 years ago, apart from through video surveillance. So that has obviously huge invasive privacy risks that attend to that as well. We're measuring more and more types of data about people, not just about their location, about, as I say, their interactions with technology, which speak to their performance, but also perhaps their physical health, their kind of physical temperature, and where your eyesight is going, your facial movements. Really common to be interviewed via video for a new position now, and that will be tracking your eye movements, your facial features, how engaging you are as a conversationalist, how enthusiastic you are. Obviously, all of these are kind of broad suppositions from training data rather than anything particularly accurate. So we have a huge amount of data being created by monitoring devices of increasing variety. The other thing that has changed quite dramatically is what is now able to be done with that data. So before, you had, say, a video monitor, CCTV loop in your workplace, and if your manager thought something was going on, they had to physically go back, look through the video evidence, work out you'd pinched a 2-penny sweet or whatever it was. Now, all of these masses of data points can be analyzed without any human input. And it can analyze for trends that human brains would not be able to detect. And it can kind of come up with conclusions about the workplace and the people within it on a kind of rapid real-time basis, which can be used to issue disciplinary sanctions, to affect behavior, to offer nudges to people. So quite a common use, I think we talked about call centers earlier. The kind of modern iteration of a call center is that you are a human speaking on the phone, hopefully, but you are also being monitored. So the ups and downs of your voice, how are you kind of is regarded as whether you're engaged or not engaged, whether you're showing empathy or not, the speed of your voice. I speak quite fast, so I would get a nudge live in real time. You need to slow down your speech. You need to talk more or less. You need to have more variation in your tone. And that would be being fed back to me live on my screen through this analytical process run by an algorithm rather than a human being. And you can imagine the impact of that knowledge that you're being constantly surveilled on every single call throughout your entire working day. You're being constantly nudged to perform better, to be a better employee, and the feeling of kind of being surveilled and being monitored, and what that would impact that would have for your kind of mental health. So that kind of example speaks to the second layer of this. All of this data that is being collated and analyzed is the kind of lifeblood of what we'll be talking about, I think, a lot for the next day or so, which is algorithmic management. So that instance of being nudged and managed by a piece of software is writ large across entire workplaces or entire functions of particular businesses. So you've got shift management being designed entirely by AI and not really being checked by a human. You've got people being disciplined and dismissed on the recommendation and the ranking produced by a piece of software. You have, for example, Uber drivers, if they don't accept enough lifts in the day, that's kind of deemed as non-compliant, so they will get suspended from their account. They're suspended enough times for enough reasons, they will get removed. And so their livelihood is taken away from them with very, very limited human input. And without this huge amount of data being taken from people all the time throughout their working lives, this would not really be possible. Some components, smaller components of it would be, but this kind of live, real-time engagement with workers and their performance and the consequences of that can be very detrimental just wouldn't be possible. So this workplace surveillance question is kind of one initial piece of this massive kind of AI algorithmic management puzzle. And obviously things like software development, data training, and all of that would also be other initial pieces of the same puzzle. So the major challenges, there are huge challenges, and some of them have already been mentioned. So the lack of genuine consent, we've already heard about. There's that power imbalance and the impossibility for many of quitting their job in response to the use of surveillance or of AI. A huge lack of transparency, in part because we have these third-party companies that we're now dealing with and are often quite poorly equipped to deal with. But often you'll find that workers just aren't aware of the tools or the capability of the tools that they're using. So office workers, for example, using Office 365, there are kind of productivity metrics that are built into that tool and can be made available to managers. And people just wouldn't be aware of those kinds of things. In other instances, it's more obvious. If you're in Amazon and you've got a handheld scanner that kind of tells you that you're being too slow, that is obviously a little bit more transparent. But how those decisions are made, why you're being told that you're too slow, that is not transparent. So for everybody, there is kind of this sense of, I don't know how I'm being managed. I don't know who's managing me and how these decisions are being made, which has a hugely negative impact on kind of the self-esteem and the job quality, the relationship with your job that those workers have. Speaking just from the UK, and I don't know whether it's the same here, obviously we're thinking quite a lot today about the role of unions. Often those kinds of workplaces where it is most extreme tend to be ununionized and very, very difficult to get kind of effective organization in. So we've seen, for example, Amazon is really at the sharp end of this. And last year and the year before, there was a really aggressive campaign, an anti-union campaign run by Amazon. And in the end, in the UK, you need to pass a ballot to kind of start bargaining with an employer. And they lost that 52%. And the workers had just kind of been terrified about the consequences of engaging with a union. So the top three concerns: negative impact on physical and mental well-being, knowing that you're being surveilled all the time, the feeling of being watched, the feeling of being managed. That's all really unpleasant, and it's very well documented that that has negative impacts on the individuals. Increased efforts to comply, so putting your physical or your mental health at risk in order to comply with expectations and the stress and anxiety that is attendant to that. We've already mentioned the impact of quality of working life. So particularly where surveillance is introduced or AI is introduced against kind of the wishes of the workforce or without their prior consent and knowledge, that feeling of distrust. Why am I being watched? Who's watching me? Like what's happening? Work intensification, it tends to be that we see increased monitoring leads to everybody working harder, pushing themselves, and the pace of work accelerates. Breakdown of community between workers, particularly where there's this idea of ranking, and for people who are trying to organize in those spaces, that's really, really challenging, a really challenging environment to get solidarity where the employer is pushing competition. Lower job satisfaction, reduced autonomy at work, all of these things that lead to good job satisfaction are eroded. And then we have this workplace surveillance as the foundation of the subsequent and potentially more damaging forms of technological management. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Philippa. And thank you to Deanna and Amy. You've all highlighted some key areas that we need to focus on, and definitely we have to take some time to unpack that. But at this stage, what I would like to do is briefly share the experiences of three workers who will sort of illustrate the different forms of workplace surveillance, as already have been mentioned mentioned by Philippa. So these examples were drawn from published research, news articles and reports, and they do highlight some of the key challenges and risks and implications of modern workplaces. So I would like to share with you the story of Carol, who was a remote worker and accountant who was monitored by software that was tracking her activity. It took screenshots of her work and captured periodically her face and the pay it was incremental in 10 minutes, and it was tied to active work intervals. And her story was featured in the New York Times, The Rise of Workplace Surveillance. There's a story of Rena, a warehouse worker, that her movements were tracked throughout the warehouse, the pace of her work. Her breaks were tracked by sensors and scanners throughout her shift. With any pause, including bathroom breaks, it was logged as time off work of task. And this was featured in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, that long shadow of workplace surveillance. And we have the story of Miguel, a long-haul truck driver who is monitored through GPS cameras and sensors that flag incidents and influence performance evaluations. This is a particular character was actually the story of that was shared in Karen Levy's book, Data-Driven Truckers, not specifically about Miguel, but it is a collective experience of truck drivers that she had done. And so I highly recommend the Data-Driven Truckers technology and the new workplace surveillance book that captures the experiences. So with these examples in mind, I'd like to proceed with specific questions for our panelists. Panelists, if you can take 1 to 2 minutes to respond to these questions. So the first question is about legitimate management oversight. In considering these 3 examples, where should the legal boundary be drawn between legitimate management oversight and respect for workers' rights? Who should have the authority to define and enforce that boundary in practice? We can start with Amy and then.
Excellent. Okay, so it's a really broad question. And I'm going to say, I don't, in my experience, the ability and the desire to monitor an employee's, let's say, performance is limited to the workday, and it should be limited to the workday. Obviously, that's like the low-hanging fruit. Okay. Next, no, I'm joking. I think when it comes to who essentially determines what the legal boundary is, I would say from a regulatory perspective, I would hope that the laws would evolve, the statutes would be updated, but I think reality is that's not going to happen. As anybody who practices, certainly in Ontario, we do have some requirements in Ontario to make sure that you notify employees that they're being surveilled and that you share some information with respect to that. And if an employer is using AI for the purposes of recruitment, that has to be disclosed. So we're making progress, but the law doesn't move fast. So I think the secondary source of where the legal boundary should be drawn will ultimately come out from decision makers. Again, you may recall about 15 minutes ago, I said they are slow. They are slow. We're slow on getting decisions from labor arbitrators, from tribunals, from the courts, but they tend to be faster than the legislature. So it's, 6 of one, half dozen of another, perhaps. The biggest question I always pose to my clients is why are you surveilling? Number one, and are you doing it for the purposes of a general status on maintaining a certain productivity level? Or is it specific to this individual? If it's specific to the individual, we always have a conversation about why. Okay, are there other ways, individual coaching, face-to-face, have that type of performance, governance, development discussions on an ongoing basis? And if it is more of a standard approach, I think you flagged this quite rightly, the question then becomes, well, who came up with this algorithm? Right? I've done a couple of these presentations before, and is it is it, the single individual who has no interruptions during the day, that has no health concerns, that is performing at a maximum optimum level every single day? Well, you have to understand that is not practical. And so you have to dig into it. Unfortunately, in Ontario and in Canada, I think it will be a bit of a piecemeal as to who is going to regulate and who is going to set the legal boundaries. And it always is. Every type of development in Ontario law and Canada to that extent is a combination of common law, civil law, as well as the legislative requirements and standards that are set out. So it will be a joint effort, and it will be a joint effort, I think, between unions and employers. Unfortunately, it will be a while before we get any real strong direction on who sets those boundaries.
Thank you, Amy. And Deanna, and then Philippa.
So I was thinking about this question from the perspective of the story of Miguel, because that's the work that I'm most familiar with in terms of the trucking industry. And I think as a starting point, I'd like to say that we do have there is an answer. The answer is just how do we define the boundary? But the boundaries we have, existed labor law frameworks where management rights are not absolute, and management rights have to be reasonable and exercised reasonably. And then we have implied limits to breaches on employee privacy. Arbitrators have always said that employees, once they step foot in the workplace, they don't abandon all their privacy rights. And workers possess other legislative rights we have from human rights legislation, occupational health legislation, everything. So the boundary has always been a balance between the employer's legitimate business interests, operational interests, and safety, productivity, and employees' legitimate interests in privacy, autonomy, and dignity. And I think what's changing today is that the scope of these tools and the magnitude of these tools is much more invasive on the privacy of workers. And so how do we say where the operational business interests of the employer and really the privacy interests of the workers overshadow that. And so in the trucking industry, we have recently seen one or two arbitrator decisions coming out where they're saying that there's a very tenuous link between what used to be just, a camera that watched outside of your truck. At some point, the camera started looking inwards towards the drivers. The camera was supposed to be in extreme accidents, used for safety purposes and preventing or reducing the number of industrial or transportation accidents. And now the cameras are not just this piece of hardware. They have huge amounts of abilities, software with the cameras that are watching the drivers, that are collecting all kinds of personal information, and are not just determining, what the driver did in the event of an accident. They're now, talking to or at the driver, giving direction, making conclusions based on if somebody's like eating or wearing sunglasses or whatever. Do they appear tired? Are they more likely to get into an accident? And the monitor is ongoing 24/7. It can be live streamed. The scope of what's happening right now is so much larger than what started off as just a camera that took a few seconds snippet recording when there was an accident. And so the arbitrators are starting to say, well, there's such a tenuous link from that vast amount of personal information you are collecting about the driver, about the worker, to your actual business interests or your operational interests of preventing major accidents, and are now starting to say that balance and that surveillance is not appropriate in to that extent. Just quickly, like who should draw this boundary? I think the answer is all of the parties, trade unions, workers, management. You know, trade unions need to be pushing for their employees' rights to privacy, pushing employers to have very clear, transparent policies, to state what the purposes of the surveillance are and why these pieces of software or other monitoring tools are being adopted in the first place at all, and then what the limits on those will be and what will be monitored and not. And then also legal decision makers and regulators to guide the workplace parties. But I think you need the on the ground level workplace parties to keep defining that boundary and assist the decision makers with the facts that they need in order to make those decisions.
Thank you, Amy and Deanna. And Philippa, if you could kindly share the UK and EU possible experience with respect to, in relation to this particular question. That'll be great. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So where should the legal boundary be drawn between legitimate management oversight and respect for workers' rights is a really excellent question. So in Europe, we obviously have the GDPR, and it's one of the things that the UK government deigned to keep, which we're very pleased about. And the EU has obviously progressed further beyond that position with the EU AI Act and the Platform Workers Directive, which I'll mention in a minute. But just taking the GDPR, there is actually quite a strict set of principles that employers as data processors, so really key actors in the data protection regime, have to abide by. And then there's also an additional layer of general human rights principles in the European Convention on Human Rights that also would influence behaviour here. So in theory, the boundary between legitimate sort of oversight and using surveillance tools and things that we would regard as unacceptable is quite tightly defined. There's quite a lot of principles that employers should engage with. So first, they must have a legitimate reason. So going back to that question that Amy asks all the time, why are you doing this? They must have a legitimate reason, which is called a lawful basis for your surveillance or any form of data processing. So that would include all of the AI tools and other measures as well. That threshold isn't huge. The employer's business interests will often be reflected in one space or another. And one thing that we'll come back to in a minute is worker consent and the role that does or indeed doesn't play in that particular stage. And then the most important question and kind of the overriding principle that you see both in the GDPR but also in human rights kind of principles is that what you've chosen to do, the software you've built or bought, must not go further than is proportionate to pursue that particular aim. So, for example, you shouldn't keep more data than is necessary. You shouldn't collect more data than is necessary. So, if your aim is attendance monitoring, really you only care about who's in and out of the building at any one particular time. You don't need much more than that, and you shouldn't retain it for more than you need to analyze it and to take any appropriate kind of coaching action or intervention that you need there. So the methods that you're choosing have to be appropriate and proportionate to what you've set out in your aim, and no more invasive. So not kind of risking an individual's privacy or other fundamental rights more than is absolutely necessary. And that kind of principle of proportionate interference, of having this legitimate aim, is really, really crucial. However, I say that this is all applicable in principle, but one of the biggest problems that we have in this area, and indeed in many other areas around this space, is the lack of enforcement. So all of these things, employers know, there will be a data protection officer somewhere, a compliance officer somewhere that knows they should be checking the systems, they should be checking the software. But because the enforcement isn't strong enough, that risk that they're taking by doing it without any compliance isn't kind of risky enough, isn't serious enough, and there isn't enough enforcement around this particular area. These kind of principles we often see just completely flouted. So you can see systems in place in a lot of workplaces, and unions will interact with their members, and they will be reporting systems that you just think there is no way those are GDPR compliant, but because the employers aren't sufficiently worried about enforcement, nothing gets done. So just really briefly on who should respond to this, I agree with both my panelists. Really, ideally, we should be dealing with a legislative intervention. The UK does not have one. The closest we have globally is the Platform Work Directive, which has transparency and kind of engagement with unions built in, as well as some clear safeguards around algorithmic management, albeit that it only applies in one particular context, which is platform work. But it would be best for the legislator to be making those decisions on who should be consulted, how implementation should happen, and particularly the question of what are we not willing to accept in our workplaces, but also in society more broadly. That is a question that legislatures legitimately should be taking, and it shouldn't be left to the courts, and it shouldn't be left to unions to fight a bit of an uphill battle to get those prohibitions in place. It should be consulting broadly across society and a legislator intervening to say certain kind of types of monitoring or certain types of use of AI are just not acceptable in this country, and if you try and sell those tools, you will be penalised. So, for example, from the EU, the Platform Work Directive has prohibited any prediction of an individual's exercise of their fundamental rights. So using tools that analyse your behaviour and think whether you might be about to sue for discrimination or wages. The reason it's banned is because it's already happened in the States. Surveillance of your psychological state is also prohibited. The monitoring of private conversations or off-duty conduct, also all prohibited in the context of platform work. So you can see that the legislator there is taking a really strong stance, seeing the risks that we've already have been highlighted by experiences globally, and saying this is the red line. You're not allowed to treat your workers in this way. And then at the next level, you'd be dealing with some collective bargains. And you can also think of those as kind of experimental spaces where you can kind of look at different approaches, look at different prohibitions that you might need in your sector. And if it works and is considered appropriate, that could be escalated and acted upon by a legislator. So that's quite an interesting way that you can think about that dynamic, that unions can lead and employers can lead in this space, particularly if you've got sectoral bargaining power that you have available to you in particular spaces. But really, it requires both. It requires a general societal stance, but also a kind of more tailored stance from workers and their employers kind of working together to work out what is and isn't appropriate.
Thank you, Philippa. That's great. So my next question is in relation to meaningful consent. How can organizations ensure that workers are meaningfully informed and able to participate in decisions around workplace monitoring while supporting both operational needs and individual choices? What would meaningful consent look like for workers like Carol, Rena, and Miguel? We'll start with Amy again.
Okay. Meaningful consent really ultimately means informed consent. And to be informed, the individual has to understand what is being used, what its purpose is, the scope of data being collected, where it's being stored, how long it's being stored. Like, it has to be informed consent. And informed consent is more than just, well, this is just going to monitor you to come in and out of the building. My definition of informed may be very different than your definition of informed, but or yours. Like, we all have I'm not pointing anybody out, but we all have very different sort of levels, particularly based on, where our clients come from. But like with any legal consent, they have to understand, the individual has to understand the scope, the purpose, what's being gathered, where it's being stored, how long it's being stored, and who has access. And so those are just the high level principles. The challenge, I think, that is out there is not all of those answers are actually known by the organizations implementing the particular surveillance, if you will. I think that's sort of a theme that's come through this afternoon, which is just because you want to use the system doesn't mean you should. And if you are going to, you need to really, truly educate yourself on what it's for and where everything's going to be saved. And so I would, I don't think that companies intentionally withhold information from, say, individual employees when they're informing them of the rollout of a surveillance program. I still have a very positive view on humankind. I think a lot of it comes from them themselves not being informed. And so they're sharing what they know, but it falls short of the full scope of what should be shared to meet that informed consent requirement.
Okay, thank you. And Deanna?
Yeah, I'm just gonna follow up on what you just said. I fully agree. In our experience dealing with a lot of employers in terms of these trucking surveillance thing, is that we ask the questions, what are the purposes of why are you putting these surveillance cameras and things into place, and employers in Ontario in non-unionized and unionized sectors are obligated to have employment policies in place, monitoring policies in place that notify employees that they're being monitored. They don't put restrictions on the monitoring, but they have to at least have the descriptions of what's the purpose, why this monitoring is happening, and like where and what is getting collected. But when we add, and so especially in the unionized sector and the bigger employers we're dealing with, they do have policies. But when we ask more specifics or try to get more information about the purpose behind it, the purposes are very broad, like safety. And then what are you collecting and how will you be using it, how will you be sharing it, or whatever. Oftentimes they don't have the answers to that, and it's maybe not ill-intentioned, it's just that they truly don't, and they're purchasing software and other things from other companies, and oftentimes we get like, here's a link to the company's sales thing or their policy. I'm sure it's fine, I'm sure it's safe, but the level of detail I think that's needed for like meaningful consent or explicit consent is just not there. And so I would say that workers like Miguel, whether in non-unionized or unionized sectors, don't have any meaningful consent. They don't understand what's being collected. They can't say no to it, and they don't have control over their own personal data and where it's going and how it's being used. And so I do think that that's where regulatory compliance, like we do have PIPEDA and other personal information protection legislation across Canada in some provinces and federally, but that legislation needs to be strengthened as well.
Thank you. Philippa?
So it's a really interesting question from a European and UK perspective, because there's long been debate about, if I consent, does that mean there is no infringement of my right? Because I've signed a piece of paper, or it's part of my employment contract, that I'm going to give you this form of data, or I'm going to permit you to surveil me, potentially in innumerable ways in the future that are not clear. Does that mean that there's been no infringement? I've signed my rights away. So in Europe, the answer is very clearly no, you don't just sign your rights away. You can't waive these really important human rights, particularly your right to privacy is where this discussion has kind of primarily fallen. And that position, that kind of hard position, is reflected in the GDPR. So in other circumstances, so like consumers can tick a box that say, I consent to your processing, and that means something that has legal value. But for an employment relationship, because of the power dynamics between the two parties, because of the fact that me as an individual has kind of a huge economic pressure to continue to work, and there will be consequences if I refuse my consent, and that would put me in difficulties. All of this kind of dynamic of baggage and complexity, historically, not just in the GDPR, but it in its previous iteration as well, this consent just doesn't mean anything for data processing purposes. That's not to say it's not relevant. Obviously, you shouldn't be forcing your employees without notice, but kind of getting that two-way consent just means absolutely nothing from a GDPR perspective. And that is a position that once you think about it, pretty much everyone kind of goes, yeah, that does kind of make sense in an employment context. So obviously I would state that individual notice, so being told, having that transparency, which is the foundation of so many informed discussions between individuals and their employer and their union, that notice is necessary. And again, the human rights principles are clear on that. But then beyond that, individual consent means nothing. And so that we have to have an alternative way of gathering that consent, and the logical place to reach to is collective bargaining, where the union, particularly as I've been learning from my own previous student, has quite a lot of power in relation to their employers, which we in the UK do not enjoy for our unions, unfortunately, anymore. You have quite a lot of power to just say, no, we think this is unacceptable. We are not giving consent on behalf of our members for you to proceed on this basis, because you are not under that kind of pressure as a union on an individual basis. But if we are in a situation where that's not achievable, having the idea of having an opt-out. So if I don't consent, the only way to have meaningful consent is to have a meaningful opt-out and to say, I don't consent to this surveillance. And that opt-out has to be free from any retaliation, any consequences. That is the only way that an opt-out would mean anything, a consent would mean anything to me. And having that kind of meaningful opt-out is just not tenable for an employing organization. If you want to have absence monitoring, it's quite an inane, it's not a particularly offensive use of monitoring, but I could really object to it. I could object to having my data processed in that way. And then if half your workforce opt out, then what's the point in buying the software in the first place? So that would be what I would expect. That would be the standard I would set. And it is unlikely to be kind of accepted by employers, or just render their use of software null and void, which I'm also absolutely okay with.
Thank you, Philippa. So all three of you did mention the amount of data that's actually collected from the workers, and given the volume and sensitivity of the workers' data that are generated by monitoring systems, what obligations do employers have regarding workers' personal data, including collection, accuracy, retention, storage, access, and secondary use? And if we, in the interest of time, if you can keep your response for about a minute, and then we're going to open it up for audience question.
Sure. How about I start? So in Canada, there are, I think there's still only 3 provinces that have privacy, or there's federal privacy legislation, and there's Alberta and BC. Am I missing one? Quebec. I don't play in Quebec, but thank you. And so those pieces of legislation actually do govern, to a certain extent, employee data and how it's been, how it can be collected, retained, et cetera. And then there's cases that have come out from that. In Ontario, it's much more ad hoc. There is no across the board sort of practice. In many cases, it involves sort of 2 areas. If you're in the labor context, it'll be a decision rendered by an arbitrator based on a grievance regarding the misuse of personal data or the collection of data with respect to an employee. And in litigation, it's sort of the opposite, insofar as there are cases out there with respect to cause of action called intrusion upon seclusion, and that is where somebody else has accessed my data. We do have in Ontario, we have PHIPA, which governs collection, control, use, disclosure, and access of personal health information, but there is a gap. There's a pretty big gap. And it's interesting because historically, the provincial government has sort of put their toe in the privacy legislation, and they pull it, and then they just we're not going to deal with it. And so I don't foresee us getting any stringent regulatory guidance on employee confidential information and personal information, the gathering and the retention of it, and what's done with it.
Okay. And Deanna, do you have any follow-up comments?
The only comment I was going to make is that I think that we do need something that to address the fact that, for example, that a lot of the data is leaving Canadian soil, and it's being held elsewhere. And so I do think that's where a major gap in our existing kind of privacy legislation, or the ad hoc, like what the adjudicators are dealing with, is that this would be something that is beyond their power, the adjudicators, to control once that data is elsewhere. And so I think, just answering the question is, what obligation should employers have? I think my answer is, like, the obligation should be on employers. And what do we do with when the data is in third parties' hands? How do we hold the third parties responsible, or how do we hold employers responsible for that data now going to third parties?
Yeah, I would just add, like, I think a lot of it comes down to people not understanding that this shiny new tool, it may provide some great advantages for certain things in the workplace, but they're not making the inquiry to find out that it's saved. And I don't mean to pick on California, it's a lovely place to visit. Maybe, I've never been. But in any event, it does attract other laws. And if you make a simple inquiry with some of the most popular types of AI software programmers, right, and contact the company, you'll find out that they actually do retain everything you plug in to the publicly accessible search engine, like, and they have no destruction timeline. And it's not immediately apparent. People just think, oh, I can get it online, it's going to just go away, but it actually doesn't. And so I think there's just a lack of information and people aren't making those inquiries.
And just to put you on the spot, Amy, so would you suggest that there is a need to, in the context of the Canadian law, that there is a need for some form of data protection legislation or some
I actually do think there is. A lot of the federal companies, financial institutions, they have extremely stringent requirements for any of their data. And I cannot remember the name of the American law, and it will come to me after I leave here and I'm driving somewhere. But as soon as your data gets into the US jurisdiction, it's now subject to a whole bunch of does anybody have it? Does anybody have the name? It'll come to me. And
U.S. purview. You're under the U.S. law when your data's in their country.
Right, and they can access anything. And so right now the stringency is no, it's a name.
Like a person?
No. It'll come to me. It's close.
This is like 20 questions.
This is fun. Sort of. But the gist of it is, it's in another jurisdiction. It's completely subject to US law. It can be accessed according to their laws. And so the restrictions that I encounter in my day-to-day practice are those that are put on us by the actual company. And so I do believe there's a gap there that needs to be addressed. And this is one of those things which is going to happen faster. And I can tell you right now, the rollout of AI is happening at a rapid pace, as we all know. And so the legislature does need to step up.
Yeah. Thank you, Amy. And Philippa, if you can please share your experiences.
I'll be really brief. If you ever need somewhere to look for inspiration for your pieces of legislation that we're all ambitiously hoping for, European data protection regulation, it's not perfect. One of the things it doesn't do great is the role of unions, to be honest, but they've kind of built on it in the Platform Work Directive to increase the role in what's called impact assessments. So checking what the risks are and your mitigating steps. That kind of process is really, really excellent if it's done well and it's not just a kind of tick box exercise. So, there's clearly global sources of norms that you can pick on and kind of use to construct a set of obligations for employers. But what I would really emphasize, and the problem that the UK particularly has fallen into, is that there are potentially extremely high penalties for data protection breaches, and you do see them happen in Europe. So H&M got hit with millions and millions of euro fines for over collection of worker data, not about consumers, but about workers. And so that was a huge shock. And there's been a number of other examples. But if those penalties aren't occurring kind of systematically, if there isn't an inspection system that makes sure that where breaches have occurred, they are picked up and they are remedied, then the system falls flat and it becomes essentially obsolete. And so making sure that there is the transparency that's required, that unions are involved in impact assessment before, but also feedback and evaluation afterwards, so that your eyes might pick up something that the employer's eyes aren't picking up, and you're able to report and you're able to improve upon those kind of systems, and ensuring that that's enabled without any retaliation. But a well-resourced inspectorate or specialist regulator, I think, is really essential in this area. And without one, any set of obligations is likely to fall quite flat. And perhaps you would end up with a situation where the unions end up taking up that slack. So there are sets of norms that are brilliant and do a lot of really good work in this area. But without that inspection, without that enforcement angle as well, they're not as useful as they might be.
Plus, in Canada, like many countries around the world, you have a division of power, right? So we've got the feds that can set law and legislation and governance for trucking industry, telecommunications, and banking. Generally speaking, the privacy rights and data collection is a provincial right, and so then you have each province that would have to sign on. So it's a challenge, but I do think you raise a very good point about looking at what's out there already, and using that as a guideline if our various governments were inclined to actually move forward and sort of roll out some standard practices.
Great. Thank you all so much for your excellent comments and insights. We will now open the floor for questions from our audience and online as well. I will begin with one question from online participant. Can the panelists speak to the role and capacity of health and safety law, particularly in respect to psychological health and safety, as a legal constraint on the use of AI for surveillance? Sure. Can the panelists speak to the role or the capacity of health and safety law, particularly in respect to psychological health and safety, as a legal constraint on the use of AI for surveillance? So use of occupational health and safety as a way to constrain the use of AI. Any thoughts? Okay.
I'm not sure how to govern it. Like, sorry, say that again.
So I believe what the person who's asking this question is trying to say is there a way for us to use occupational health and safety legislation to hold or to find ways for workers to file claims against their employers, for instance, in cases of work intensification, when there is potential.
So there's a harassment. There's protections under the Occupational Health and Safety Act against harassment in the workplace. Admittedly, I'm not knee deep in occupational health and safety law unless it involves mines. I'm all over mining if anybody has a question about mining. But I think it would be probably a harassment complaint that would be brought. I'm not sure there's much else under the Occupational Health and Safety Act that actually specifically would give more of a protection. Like, I can't.
Yeah,
do you do? Pardon?
How about a hazardous work practice?
Yeah. And that could be, it could be, I'm just trying to think, say if data is collected and there's a breach and somebody else gets involved in it, that could fall under some protections in the Occupational Health and Safety Act.
Possibly. Work intensification and unreasonable or unbearable pace of work provisions that are implemented through of AI and surveillance, I don't think it might qualify as hazardous work practices that could be challenged.
It could be, as could harassment, right? Like, so there is.
Harassment is an interpersonal thing. Oh, I'm so sorry.
So there, yeah, it could be. It requires an argument. There's not an express provision, put it that way, under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, but could be. There's also, you know, I don't know if there'd be a workplace comp argument to be made if somebody's experiencing psychological damage or injury as a result of these AI programs. There's also the human rights code that would provide certain protections. But there's nothing expressly out there right now that deals with AI and collection of personal data or setting certain performance standards.
Right. There's certainly a gap. And
there is a gap, yeah.
A lot of creativity needed to figure out and how we can potentially be able to use those legislations.
Yeah.
Kate, from, if I can please invite.
Je vais parler en français.
Oui.
Correct?
Oui.
OK. Merci beaucoup le panel. C'était très intéressant. Je vais me présenter à l'INDEG, président du local 700 Unifor. Et aussi, je suis sur l'exécutif pour le transport routier. Donc, j'ai trouvé ça super intéressant. Ça touche beaucoup qu'est-ce qui se passe dans mes lieux de travail et aussi au niveau du transport. Peut-être juste commentaire, peut-être à Amy, que je t'écoutais, là, c'est côté patronal pour nous autres, je suis syndicaliste, donc des fois on s'entend pas, bien souvent je m'entends pas avec, surtout au niveau des caméras. Puis qu'est-ce qui arrive souvent, j'ai 42 lieux de travail, puis j'ai 42 différents employeurs qui sont là, puis je les trouve tous un peu cochons au niveau des caméras. Une affaire qu'ils font, puis même quand je parle avec d'autres représentants au niveau du syndicat, les caméras se font tout le temps poser la fin de semaine. C'est bizarre, ça. Donc, quand le lieu de travail ferme, les caméras se font poser. Le syndicat ne se fait jamais informer. C'est sûr, on le voit, on rentre lundi, on se fait appeler par nos membres, il y a des caméras partout. Déjà là, ça commence mal, on se comprend. Là, le couple, là, il ne va pas bien déjà. Ça fait que là, il y a toute la question, pourquoi ils font ça à cachette? Pourquoi qu'ils rentrent pas, pourquoi qu'ils parlent pas au syndicat? C'est sûr de notre bord, puis moi, personnellement, je suis contre les caméras totalement. Ça sert à rien pour moi. Je me fais répondre souvent des réponses. Exemple, je vais te donner un exemple d'un de mes lieux de travail. Puis j'étais en négociation, puis c'était des avocats d'Ontario qui étaient là. C'était drôle, qu'est-ce qu'ils m'ont répondu. Ils ont mis des caméras dans la cafétéria. Puis quand j'ai dit, t'as pas le droit, tu vas enlever tes caméras. Puis il m'a dit, non, c'est important parce que quelqu'un se fait voler ses sandwichs. Tu sais, c'est ridicule, là. Ça fait que souvent, on se fait poser, tu sais, au niveau de la transparence, puis le pourquoi des caméras, peut-être qu'est-ce que l'employeur, toi, te dit, puis qu'est-ce qu'il dit au syndicat, c'est deux différentes histoires complètement. Puis souvent, je réponds aux employeurs, tu sais, je leur donne l'exemple. Avant de le faire à mon monde, à ma gang, fais-le à ta gang. Mets des caméras dans vos bureaux, mets-en 3 dans les bureaux, une en face des toilettes, avec des microphones, parce qu'il y en a, ils ont des microphones, hein, dans mes trucks, ils ont des microphones. Puis le syndicat, on va être capable d'évaluer qu'est-ce qui se passe avant que vous les mettez en arrière. Tu sais, souvent, je trouve que l'employeur va imposer quelque chose à ses travailleurs, mais lui, il va pas le faire. Il donne pas l'exemple. Tu sais? Fait que, tu sais, au niveau de ça, là, je trouve ça, puis c'est la santé mentale là-dedans. Souvent, mes membres, puis quand ils voient des caméras, le stress, je me fais surveiller à travailler. Je pense qu'ils n'ont pas besoin de ça. La performance, là, les compagnies, au niveau de la performance, il faut que ça roule, il faut que ça roule. Puis, ils n'ont pas le droit de se servir des caméras pour regarder quelqu'un travailler. Mais ils s'en servent. Les superviseurs sont moins souvent sur le plancher, plus dans le bureau, parce qu'ils font le gardien de sécurité. Ils sont assis en avant de leurs écrans, puis ils regardent qu'est-ce qui se passe sur le plancher. Puis après ça, soudainement, ils viennent voir le travailleur, puis ils disent, ah, tu parlais de quoi? Puis là, syndicat, on s'implique, puis on dit, ben là, pas le droit de servir des caméras pour ça. Ben non, je m'en sers pas pour ça, mais ils s'en servent pour ça la majorité du temps. Puis la majorité du temps, les employeurs nous disent, ben, au cas que quelqu'un pète une machine, au cas qu'il y a du vol, au cas, mais c'est tous des au cas qu'il y a vu extrêmement rarement dans nos lieux de travail.
Merci, monsieur. Est-ce qu'on peut donner le panéliste pour répondre à votre question? Merci. You can respond to some of the comments.
I was going to say, should we take a couple of questions? Because
Sure.
Yes.
Yes.
J'en ai juste un autre, puis c'est fini après, c'est correct?
Oui, monsieur, si on peut entendre les autres et peut-être vous pouvez, si vous avez une question.
Oui, c'est vite.
Oui, vous avez, oui, c'est bon que vous avez parlé. Oui. If I may, please invite other participants to, if you may, please ask a question. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll go fast. Do I finish or not?
If they have heard your comments and they will respond to it. If there's one specific question that you do have, then perhaps you can quickly ask that question.
Oui, s'il vous plaît.
OK.
Fait que c'est ça, tu sais, au niveau des caméras, je veux savoir vraiment, il y a pas, moi, je vois qu'il n'y a pas vraiment d'utilité, puis le pourquoi que les employeurs nous disent, puis la transparence n'est pas là.
Oui.
Que ce soit dans un lieu de travail ou que ce soit même dans un truck, au niveau du stress, la santé mentale, j'ai une caméra qui me pointe dessus avec un microphone. Je comprends pas comment que ça va aider au niveau de que je travaille, que je suis bien dans mon environnement.
Okay.
Merci.
Merci, monsieur. Merci. May I invite you to also share a question?
No.
If you could kindly make it very brief, as we have some time constraints now.
Yeah, I always
Thank
make
you.
sure I'm brief. Thank you.
Thank you.
So first and foremost, thank you, Aida, for the moderation, and thank you, Diana, Philippa, and Amy for your comments. Really appreciate it. To the point. So, okay. So I want to ask. In the context of AI regulation, meaningful consent, and labor law, where does human dignity come into play when the rights of workers are being infringed upon for the sake of surveillance, which can be deemed to be both excessive and most importantly unnecessary? Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Thank you. And if I can kindly ask for you to share briefly.
Oh, okay, sure. Thank you very much. This is in regards to the storage of data that is taken from the employers. With that in mind, what are the legal risks/exposures for companies when they store the data in a foreign nation, should anything happen to an employee where that data is taken, for example, in the United States? And then additionally, what sort of protections are there for the employees that their data is not being sold to a third party or to a large language model-based operation?
Thank you. Amy?
Yeah, so I think you won't probably be surprised that I think there's a big open gap. And off the top of my head, I'm actually not aware of anything, certainly in Ontario, that implements or imposes particular penalties other than, I suppose there could be that argument of intrusion upon seclusion. So I gave you my private information, you allowed somebody else to have access to it, or you didn't put in place sufficient safeguards. That's a civil proceeding. Federally, you might have an argument. If it's health information, you very likely have an argument with respect to who has access, because it's very well defined under PHIPAA. I think that there's a gap in the law. And unfortunately, I wish I had some more concrete information for you, but I think the recourse will be, I think, through civil litigation. I don't know, have you encountered a labor matter yet about that?
About the data leaving.
Yeah. No, I haven't encountered a labor matter involving that. I have encountered civil matters, so a non-unionized workplace where that has been a concern raised. And so that's all I can really advise. There is a gap. And unfortunately, what that means then is the individual who's impacted by the leak of their data would have to bear the fight until or unless provincial and territorial and the federal government comes in with more stringent requirements on who has access to data.
There was one particular question from our first, from our participants about cameras, the use of cameras without workers' knowledge. If you can kindly, any of the panelists could respond to that question, please. And then there was a second question about dignity. Where does dignity fall in this discussion?
So, how about I start? The surveillance in Ontario, you have to notify employees. There has to be signage that surveillance is up, and you're actually gathering data. It provides something, right? Not perfect, but it provides something. Surreptitious recording is going to be a real problem because that's currently not permitted. In like if you have like workplace surveillance cameras, where's the gentleman? If you have cameras in the workplace, you are required under the Employment Standards Act to post notification that they're out there. As far as some of the concerns that were raised with the cameras and the broad scope of them, I'm not here to advocate for a broad scope of cameras in the workplace. I will say that I think in certain circumstances they are appropriate, but I also am a believer that you need to be forthright with your staff and they need to see what is being done, what surveillance is being conducted, and have a basic understanding as to what it's for. I think it's odd that there were cameras and a microphone outside of a bathroom. That's peculiar, but you know, I think that you can't really have a blanket, oh, this is all reasonable. I think each scenario, each workplace, and each placement of any type of surveillance monitoring has to be looked at in and of itself. And that broad sweeping implementation of surveillance isn't, it's going to be very hard to defend.
I think on the dignity question, I think it's a really interesting point you raise. But for me, we have gaps and every jurisdiction has gaps. Canada is definitely not alone in that. No one has kind of regulated this space comprehensively. And if they did, it would soon be out of date anyway. So, but we need a kind of web of individual, collective. We need consent and union consent. We need a respectful and robust framework of legislative protections. All of that, much like labour law itself, is the foundation to achieve dignity in the workplace. And I would say that surveillance particularly, but also anything where the individual doesn't understand how or why they're being treated a particular way is a threat to dignity. And obviously surveillance as well has significant impact on autonomy and how you perform your work. But we need a kind of complex puzzle of types of protection, and only through achieving that and having that effectively enforced by individuals and by their unions, those are the kinds of conditions where we would be able to achieve the dignity that we're seeking in the workplace.
Okay, with that point, I'd like to conclude this panel. I'd like to sincerely thank our panelists, Amy Tibble, Deanna Slonovic, and Philippa Collins for their excellent contribution to today's conversation. The discussion has highlighted the complexity of the surveillance in contemporary workplace, including the importance of setting clear boundaries, governance, and protection for workers' rights beyond privacy concerns. Thank you also to our audience in person and online for your thoughtful questions and engagement. I'm sorry we could not get to all the questions, but we hope today's dialogue inspires further research, reflection, and action on the critical issues highlighted today. Thank you very much.
Thanks.